Do you think two people agreeing to get into a monogamous relationship is oppressive in some way?
What does the agreement look like? I mean...
We're going to date each other and we can't sleep with anyone else or date anyone else.
I think if everybody did that, it's oppressive on a collective level.
Do you think it's oppressive for individuals to do that?
Or maybe unhealthy? Do you think that it's indicative of authoritarianism?
Well, I did say that I thought monogamy was a fetish. Maybe that's closer to what I think than saying that it's oppressive. Maybe not every fetish is oppressive, but I think of it more like a kink relationship now.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Multiversity Project. We've got an exciting episode on relationship anarchy coming up, but first, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment. Special shoutouts to Sam and David, Sam for being our first patron, and David for donating to us on PayPal. If you want to be cool like Sam and David, check out our Patreon and our PayPal donations page. Okay, so now get ready to get anarchic, because today we're going to be discussing relationship anarchy. That's right. We're going to be diving into anarchy, and for many of our fans, this will be the other kind of anarchy. The kind that doesn't like capitalism, and in this case, likes practicing non-hierarchical and non-rule-based personal relationships. Relationship anarchy is a leftist movement, which tends to be critical of monogamy as a hierarchical and oppressive institution. I'm Ariel.
I'm Katie.
And I'm Chris.
And please welcome Adam Goulding, right over here, who will be our guest on today's show. Adam is a very special guest for a few reasons, one being that he's our first far leftist guest and identifies as a far leftist, anarcho-pacifist, methodological anarchist, and relationship anarchist. So Adam, let's start with the personal. How did you become a relationship anarchist?
Well, I guess there's how you realize that you are one. I mean, anarchy in general turns out to run through a lot of different political movements. So, like, maybe atheism was one of my first anarchisms, so to speak, questioning the power of the church and all that, and certainly identified as a feminist at a young age via my mother, who was also a hippie, which is a kind of anarchism some people might use it. So for me, it wasn't so much a matter of becoming one, but realizing that I was one, in the sense that I was always very skeptical of power, which is basically how Chomsky defines anarchism. And it applies naturally to relationships if you have that skepticism in a very general way.
Okay, so it sounds like for you, relationship anarchism is very much tied to anarchism.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about maybe the theoretical foundations for your anarchism?
Well, I mean, I realized I could use the label when I learned about how Chomsky defines anarchism for himself, because he has a very a definition that doesn't require you to know the whole history of anarchism to realize, oh yeah, that describes me. And it's just basically being skeptical of domination is one of the phrases that he uses, and placing the burden of proof on anyone who thinks that a power difference should exist. So if someone says, like, oh, there should be a government institution that does X and they have a good reason, then under that kind of anarchism, you can accept that if the reason is good enough. So it's more of a method for testing power, making it a priority to question power.
So what types of institutions has this philosophy caused you to question?
I mean, well, I guess I was saying at the outset that I questioned the church at an early age. It's not necessarily an institution in every case, like questioning misogyny isn't necessarily an institution. I mean, I don't know where the office is that I go protest at. But certainly people will say it's institutionalized, and it is, so.
Yeah, this is kind of how I understood Chomsky's argument. It's kind of like, well, if there's a state power and it is dominant in the society, then as long as it justifies itself, then it should continue to exist. But if it doesn't justify itself, then it should be dismantled. And so, yeah, I see that as kind of like it could potentially lead to anarchism, but it seems like maybe in practice it usually doesn't.
Well, he doesn't say that could lead to anarchism. He says that's what anarchism is that process, basically. That at one point he calls it a tendency in human thought to question domination. And I think, I certainly latched onto that formulation, that it's not a position, it's a tendency in thinking. And some people have more of this tendency.
Right. So what I'm saying is that you could be living in today's society under a government as an anarchist, under that definition of anarchy, and be perfectly happy. And basically just be like, okay, well, the government is perfectly legitimate, and I'm still a perfectly happy anarchist. So I think that's a little bit different from how most people expect anarchism to be defined.
Yeah, and the burden of proof is on one side of that is sort of the anarchist position. Because you could say, like, oh yeah, it's an important question, but by default, power is justified. By default, might is right. But I think the anarchist default is the other default, saying by default, power is not justified. And until it's justified, we treat it as unjustified.
How would you conceptualize relationship anarchy in its relationship to this skepticism and anarchism?
Right. Well, I mean, you can question power in a given relationship, like, is this person dominating that person? You can also question power differences between relationships. So, like, say, like, if you have two friends and one friend demands a lot more of your time than the other friend, and you might question power difference where this friend says, like, oh, you can't do that because, like, I'm your better friend, so therefore you have to do this with me or something like that. That would be a power difference between the relationships, and there could be a good reason for it, there could be a bad reason for it. And you can question power differences between types of relationships, because someone might say, like, well, they're just your friend, I'm your romantic partner, and that's like a type of relationship that has power over this other type of relationship, therefore, you have to do this with me, or I get this priority, or something like that. So there could be a power difference between people in a relationship, between two other people that one person is in various kinds of relationships with, or between different types of relationships. So the idea of questioning them is, like, as opposed to just sort of taking the default script given to you by society and saying, well, this type of relationship is more important, or what have you.
So basically the idea of relationship anarchy is a philosophy that derives from anarchism, and basically suggests that each relationship should be taken on its own terms and not necessarily defined according to pre-existing categories that come from society or what have you, and that they should all be non-coercive and voluntary. So you could have, like, a platonic friend be your life partner. And
I think the stigmas we have against plurality of, let's say, romantic intimacy aren't that different from other stigmas we have against intimacy. I mean, it's in our society. I mean, I think it's probably true, and I think it's not just sexuality and romance that are sort of repressed in this way.
What else is repressed?
Well, I just think people could be a lot more connected, period, like, whether it's, like, intellectually, platonically, musically, anything like that. I mean, there's a lot of different forces. One of them is the mononormativity of you're supposed to know a small number of people very well and just don't get to know other people, is essentially how it works out for a lot of people.
Yeah, I can kind of relate to this. I have experience in both monogamous and non-monogamous relationships, and I went through a long period of about 3 or 4 years where I was very explicitly, philosophically non-monogamous, polyamorous, flirted with relationship anarchy, but didn't like the label because I didn't consider myself a leftist anarchist. But what I've taken from that, even though I am in a monogamous relationship now, and I realize that I like monogamous relationships, is that previously I was holding myself back from getting close to anybody because I was afraid that I might develop some kind of feelings for them. And now I'm just okay with having crushes on people, even if I know I'm not going to act on them. And I don't feel like I need to distance myself from the relationship. I'm okay with different kinds of closeness that I wasn't before. And that's been something that's been hugely beneficial for me.
Great to hear it. Yeah. Oh, it's funny that, so you say that you, like, converted back to monogamy or something like that?
Kind of. Well, yes. I mean, I'm in an exclusive monogamous relationship, and my last, like the one I'm in now, and my previous one also was that way. I'm curious because in questioning all of these different power differentials, do you find monogamy to be inherently oppressive, like misogyny or like other things that you would consider power differentials that are bad?
I found this question controversial enough that I usually have to make a distinction when it comes up. I think something like accidental monogamy is no more oppressive than, like, being an introvert. If you're introverted, you don't meet many people, you don't get attracted to that many people or whatever. It's just who you are. Now, maybe politically it's bad if everybody's an introvert. That's a collective question, maybe. Maybe we need a certain amount of extroversion for, like, political health, and isolation can politically weaken people. But I think it's really different when the monogamy starts to become, let's use the term, enforced in one way or another. And a more moderate position might just say, well, it's just a question of how it's enforced, and some methods of enforcing monogamy are okay, and other methods of enforcing are not okay. So, like, like stalking your partner and reading their messages is not an okay way to enforce monogamy. But somebody might think that, oh, no, it's okay once they've started cheating on you because, then they've broken the terms, and, like, you must enforce these regulations somehow because the government won't do it for you, and it's, only right that agreements be enforced or something like that. I mean, I don't know, I've heard things dangerously close to that reasoning before.
Wait, so
I'm
not sure I totally
It can be very oppressive, and I don't think it's a coincidence. It's not just like you could oppressively enforce anything.
I'm not sure I totally understand that reasoning that you were kind of disparaging there.
Well, I mean, it's like with any right, like take the example of a government regulation. Once you have it, you have to enforce it somehow, and even though the regulation might be just, it might be most of the ways of enforcing it might be unjust.
Well, what I'm understanding, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but let me know if I am. So if we're in a relationship and we're just like, satisfied with it and like kind of too lazy or too introverted to go out and meet other people, and that's just our preference, that's fine by you. But if we're in a relationship
on an individual level, if everybody was like that, it could be a problem clinically.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. But if two people are in a relationship or if I'm in a relationship with someone and I'm like, I don't want you going out and being with other people, then in your view, that would be oppressive.
Well, I don't know if like applying the label oppressive is so much the main issue. I mean, I would recommend that people not accept relationships where people make those demands. I think as a form of collective action, that could be positive. If people sought out relationships where the other person craves their freedom, as opposed to telling what to do.
Okay, I just want to clarify, because you said you have no issue with accidental monogamy and liken that to introversion. Do you mean just people who... Individually. So by accidental monogamy, do you mean like two people who get into a relationship that is in theory open, but just aren't dating other people?
Yeah, basically.
Okay. What about two individuals where it wasn't like one person said, I don't want you going out and seeing other people, but where both people just feel that they would be happier and more comfortable if they were exclusive?
Well, what does that mean to be exclusive if it's not a matter of one person telling the other person not to do it? I mean, if you're deciding to do it, you're like placing some obligation on the future, as opposed to like predicting, like, I probably won't meet a second partner or something like that.
Well, it can be one person telling the other person to do it, or it could be two people deciding to do it. I guess there is an inherent self-restriction. It's kind of like if you're deciding for yourself, I'm choosing to be a vegetarian or something like that. You're choosing to restrict yourself from certain action. Doesn't mean that the other person is going to start stalking your cell phone or whatever. It just means that if you don't want to do that anymore, the terms of the relationship have changed and it might end.
Well, okay, the Lysistrata, the old, I mean, I don't know the plainest entirely, but the basic idea of like the old play where there's a sex strike by the women to stop the men from having a war. And forget the details of that. The general outline is that it's collective action via personal boundaries. So like, if you have the basic assumption of like individual bodily autonomy, everyone gets to sort of vote with their consent, then you can still say, well, what's a good way to vote for the outcome that you want? And so you might say, oh, yeah, people can refuse polyamorous relationships. They can refuse monogamous relationships. You might say, like, yeah, everyone's free to vote with their relationship as they wish. You can still criticize how somebody votes while still supporting their freedom to vote however they want. So you might say, like, yeah, like people should be able to refuse polyamorous relationships, but you could say that maybe they shouldn't. People might differ in terms of what's a good consideration. You might say, like, it should just be based internally on the relationship. But if you say, like, think globally, act locally, if you really believe something like that, you might say, like, well, you're supposed to also consider, if you universalize this action, what if everybody approached relationships like that? What society would we have? I don't know, flexibility is universally useful, and I think that sort of openness to experience of growing through future relationships can I think they can help society grow.
Do you think there's a special kind of growth that only comes through multiple romantic relationships? Because you seem to be going back to this growth argument a lot.
I think it's more so to do with intimacy, and I think, different people achieve intimacy in different ways, and it's obviously not easy, so it's not a matter of saying, like, well, you should just achieve intimacy this other way, because maybe person A achieves intimacy more easily in one way, and another person achieves intimacy more easily in another way. But I think intimacy is difficult enough that you shouldn't be sort of just blocking routes to it.
I mean, the basic assumption there is that more intimacy exists in a multi-partner kind of context.
Possible. It won't necessarily. And some people, it's true. I think you might be able to mention how many people will want to have many relationships in order to avoid intimacy and having lots of casual sex and partners that they don't really develop a connection with.
I mean,
so
maybe.
I'm not really arguing for that.
I mean, I get the sense that you're not really arguing for that. You're arguing for like multiple emotionally invested relationships of various kinds.
Yeah, and like varying degrees of seriousness too. Like it's the same with friendships. Some people very well and other people not as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just my sense is that, at least in my life, when I've tended to have like multiple that sort of attitude of this one here and that one there, and like the multiple.
Well, I didn't say that attitude.
But like multiple, when it's been more multiple, I don't know. I have a sense it tends not to go as deep as when there's like a concentrated investment in one person with some level of exclusivity.
Well, it's probably harder to fall in love with two people simultaneously than it is to be in love with two people simultaneously. Because falling in love takes more time than being in love and more sort of emotional energy. Because like getting to know someone, like getting to know like their childhood history, all of their sort of emotional quirks and so on. once you know somebody really well, it becomes very efficient to interact with them. That's part of what the intimacy is, I think, is like knowing somebody well enough that you can have this sort of high bandwidth interaction that you can't with a stranger, because with a stranger, you still have to get to know them. And so like getting to know two people at the same time could be very difficult.
So just a couple of things to ask about. The first thing is, so do you think that there are limits to intimacy? Like, do you think that there are, like, you can get to know somebody this much, and then after that, you can't get to know them anymore? Or do you think it's kind of more infinite? Like the more you trust, the more time you spend with them, and the more trust you build up with them, the more the better it gets, and it's kind of just infinite.
Well, this answer might surprise you. The first part, if free will doesn't exist, then there are definitely limits, because at a certain point, someone has to have input from somewhere else to remain unpredictable and seem like they have free will. Now, I'm not necessarily that skeptical of free will, but if you don't believe in free will, the answer is a definite yes, because otherwise, in the long run,
yes, as in there's a limit to how well people can get to know each other if we include free will.
Just each other. Like if free will doesn't exist and two people know each other infinitely well, then they can predict what the other person is going to say. They can literally finish each other's sentences. They don't actually need to talk to each other until they talk to a third person, and then if person A doesn't know what person C said to person B, then they no longer can perfectly predict what person B is going to say.
So it's not just free will. It would be more like determinism.
Well, you're never going to have that situation, regardless of whether you're in multiple relationships or not. Like, even if you were living in the same bedroom and never left and only spoke to one another, you'd still be perceiving things out of different sets of eyes. There would always still be new information entering one consciousness that the other person wouldn't be aware of. And in a monogamous relationship, you probably have separate jobs. You probably talk to friends separately. Like you wouldn't need an outside romantic partner in order to inject.
Have something to talk about. Not necessarily. And I was answering the theoretical question of like, is there a limit? And maybe basically you're saying in practice you don't reach that limit because there's always is this other information. That being said, I mean, there's also qualitatively different kinds of information. I do think that you learn something different in different kinds of relationships.
So I think more what I'm getting at is it's this issue of trust. Like, the more I trust somebody, the more I feel like I know them. And so even if I can't predict what they're going to do exactly, I can trust that what they're going to do is going to be good for them and good for me. Where I'm kind of coming from this is that trust actually comes from predictability. Like they definitely are related. I'm gonna compare it to a different part of life that has nothing to do with people. It's when I decided to just pick a location to live in and just commit to living in one city for many years. I found that my life improved because I was able to predict my own future behavior. And so basically other people were able to trust me more because I was able to I was able to just be more predictable. And I think one of the benefits of monogamy, or one of the benefits of picking one person, is that you can be a lot more predictable in your relationships. You can bring that sense of predictability in, and so then you can keep increasing trust. Does that resonate at all?
Well, this will definitely come up in our conversation about music, because I don't actually like predictability that much, which probably explains a lot. And I think people who like me like that I'm a little unpredictable. But I get what you're saying. Of course, I'm not completely unpredictable, and that's part of why it's possible for people to trust that I won't just like literally explode into flames, or like, physical objects are predictable. Trust the laws of physics because of the predictability that they give us, and so on. But I also think a lot of the oppression of our society is about making people predictable. A lot of effort is gone to make people predictable, that they're going to go through a certain predictable job path, they're going to be on a predictable schedule, they're going to do predictable things, so we have social order and all this. And I think certainly at a time, I mean, you might make a different argument if we were in a different period historically where we didn't need political change really rapidly. But I think predictability is like bad right now. I think if things proceed predictably right now, things will go really badly. So predictability is not so great at the moment.
Well, it depends on what the pattern is. If the pattern is adaptive, then I think predictability can be great. If the pattern is maladaptive, then the pattern, going on as we are is obviously harmful.
But let's not lose your question about limits to intimacy, because like the predictability is sort of part of that. And you're right, that's related to trust. And the trust is related to the other factor that I was going to bring up, which is sort of psychoanalytic depth. Because I have encountered, both in romantic relationships and even just in philosophical settings, as you start peeling back the onion of like the mind or a person's mind or something like that, you'll hit a certain level where they don't want to go any deeper. And like, it's not as though I haven't experienced the same myself. And sometimes, actually, a friend of mine expressed this to me, this sort of theory about why some relationships break down. Sometimes one person makes the other person confront something that they're not ready to confront yet. Now, that's, in a way, that's a barrier to intimacy. Now, you might think, well, but maybe once you aren't repressing anything and you've, like, quote unquote, dealt with all your shit, as if anyone ever does that. You just keep getting more shit every day. You got to deal with the next backlog. But, you know, let's talk about theoretical limits. Suppose, like, two people have truly dealt with all their shit. You know, there's nothing that they're not going to hit a wall as like they're repressing. Like, is that the main barrier that people have to intimacy? I mean, I do think there's this other factor of having diverse experiences. And I do think that just having talking about how your job was different today than your partner's job isn't, like, you know, the most widely different experience to share with somebody.
But I guess I'm curious, like, do you agree that there is some kind of trade-off between variety and intensity, like scope and depth? Like, we can probably agree, like, in some sense, having multiple relationship offers more variety. But I also have a sense that an exclusive relationship with one person maybe offers all that, like, that process of going into the depths and the intensity and confronting things about yourself. I have a sense that it may offer more depth. Well,
take just the case of friendships, let's say, as the number of friends that you have increases over your lifespan. So suppose everybody lives for the same amount of time. We all live for 100 years, let's say. Yay, that's probably a good outcome. Anyway, a bonus life for several people. Suppose we all live for 100 years, and we have over the course of our life, like, I don't know, 1,000 friends if Facebook is to be believed. And, you know, if you multiply that number of friends by 10, then you're definitely going to have to decrease the depth of some of those friendships, for sure. That being said, I do think that, like I was saying earlier, part of that is it takes time to get to know somebody. And once you know somebody really well, you can maintain a connection more easily. And I have found that myself, as I age, my perspective becomes more poly because I have all these past attachments and, you know, people that I've known in the past and my, you know, theory of them and they have their theory of me and so on already built up. And so once you've put in that time of getting to know people well, then, like, well, you know more people well. And that's, you know, a different experience. Now, you might say, yeah, but you could have kept getting to know that one person more deeply. Well, in the case of the psychoanalytic block, you might have reached an impasse in that relationship and that you can't go deeper in that relationship at that time. Mm-hmm. And that if you're trying to maximize how much, you know, how deep you dig mentally, let's say, then you might maximize that if you sort of don't push it too far when you hit a wall in terms of how far someone wants to dig mentally in one case and, you know, dig elsewhere. And you get more digging. You dig deeper on average. You dig more total depth, even if you don't dig the deepest hole.
Putting this into practice, though, you've mentioned a couple of times that it takes a lot of investment initially to get to know a new person. It takes a lot more energy to fall in love. And then it takes a lot more energy to fall in love than to stay in love. But what that leads to, like, at least in my experience, and it seems like it's a common experience in people who are non-monogamous and polyamorous, is that long-term relationships are deprioritized for a time when you're falling in love with a new person. And that's the thing that doesn't work so well for me about it. It's like, even if you set intentional time to stay with your long-term partner, emotionally, biologically, physiologically, when you're falling in love with a new person, your mind is on them. And I don't think that's always the most conducive to maintaining a partnership with somebody if you're trying to build the foundation.
You could say the same about having a new child, having a second child. If you already have a, you know, parental relationship with one child, you have another child.
Oh, but that's something that you're doing within the family unit. Like, that child is going to be the sibling of the child that you previously had.
Well, you might all be part of a community of some kind. I mean,
true.
I think maybe our society should be a bit more like a family. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe our society should behave more like a family. It is, like, I have to admit, it's a little bit different if your new partner and your primary partner know each other and are interacting with each other. That's a very different experience than having atomized relationships.
personally, I'd say that's ideal, but some people have more like separate friendships, even let alone their romantic relationships. I like everyone to get along.
Do you see that though? Like, have you found? I mean, maybe it's not what you like or what you're going for, but have you noticed within non-monogamous communities that there seems to be like a pattern of breakups and tumultuousness when new love is happening and old relationships being neglected?
Well, sometimes parents neglect their child when they have a new child, and I think that's bad too. Because that's a case where you can apply the anarchist method. You can say, well, what would justify this power difference between my children? Why should I give my second child more attention than my first child? And it might be that nothing justifies that, so actually you have to reduce the power difference because it's not justified. And yeah, I think being a good partner is like being a good parent in that respect, and that you shouldn't neglect the relationships that you have. Now, it also depends on like who is in need at what time, because you might have relationships with people who are very self-sufficient, but like once in a while someone needs a lot of your attention, and maybe there's somebody that you're already very invested with that person. So like, I don't know, like if you've just been a new friend and your old friend is going through like a personal tragedy, you're probably going to say to your friend, well, hold on, my old friend is going through a personal tragedy. I'm going to talk to them this week. Like, I'll talk to you next week. That's like not neglecting your existing relationship.
Isn't that kind of breaking their trust though? Like, isn't that it? Because you're being less reliable maybe than they were expecting. You're imposing a limit to how much they can rely on you, which probably imposes a limit to how vulnerable they can be with you.
Less reliable to the new friend?
Exactly.
That's to be expected though, because like,
if somebody needs you and you're not there, then they have to go find somebody else. And so there's that you're basically breaking the trust, and you have to heal that, by putting extra energy into the relationship.
Yeah, but the new friend hasn't sort of learned to count on you yet, and like part of learning to count on somebody involves knowing their history and how many ties they in fact have. I mean, like, if you've just met somebody who's already lived a chunk of their life, you don't know how many people there are in their past who might say, like, I need to talk to you or something like that.
Right, exactly. And so what I'm saying is there's a limit to how reliable you can be in such a relationship. Whereas if you're in a committed relationship, then basically you've committed to always being there for that person.
I don't know about that.
All right.
Like, do we think that a romantic relationship means you're always there? I don't necessarily think that.
At some point, for one thing. No, answer my questions in the.
I mean,
world.
if you can be, then yeah, and then basically, as long as if the person can figure out the pattern and you can be there often enough that it makes a difference, then I think that affords more intimacy. Like if you're constantly being unpredictable and they constantly need you and you're not there, then they're just going to go find somebody else.
Well, if you have friends and one of your friends needs to talk to you and you're not available that week because you're like in the Bahamas, they will find somebody else, hopefully, to talk to. I should hope so. It's better than them having to talk to you. But doesn't mean they're not going to talk to you later. I mean, it's...
But what I'm saying is you're breaking the trust a little bit when you do that.
I don't...
You're putting a little paper cut on the relationship.
I don't know. I would place the onus, to at least to some extent, on the other side. Like, the person having the expectations, it is a little bit codependent. Like, if I'm expecting you to always be available by phone whenever I feel sad...
Yeah,
and
work,
then that's kind of my problem. Like, that's kind of my problem, not your problem.
Sure, and if if we break that trust one time and that's the only time, then that can be healed and that can lead to an even higher level of intimacy. But what I'm saying is that if like there's a limit to how many times that can happen before the relationship becomes kind of not viable.
It depends on what the situation is, right? Like, if we agree to have like a phone call every day at 5 and you're constantly missing it, maybe that's your problem. But if my expectation is that you're always going to be available for me whenever I need to talk, then that's an unrealistic expectation.
I mean, yes, maybe. But at the same time, I think, again, like regardless of who's in the right, if I need some support and the person that I expect to be there is not there, then that's a step back on the trust. Basically, it reduces the level of trust.
What's damaging the trust is that you're expecting someone to be there without them having agreed to meet those expectations, whether you're in a monogamous relationship or not. Okay,
but what if they have agreed to meet those expectations?
That's different.
Yeah. And the difference is that affords a much higher level of trust in the relationship. If two people agree to put each other as the highest priority in the relationship, then that affords a much higher degree of trust in the relationship.
Okay. I don't think you want to equate trust and predictability quite so much. I mean, the analogy that you used of the paper cut made me think of, anti-fragility, that concept in like the discourse now of like something that gets stronger when you break it, so to speak. And, in the case of certain kinds of codependency, you actually want a certain number of paper cuts to like, I don't like using the phrase toughen yourself up because it gets really misapplied, especially justifying various kinds of abusive dynamics. But I think you have to be able to cope with your partner not being able to talk for a whole day or something. Oh my God, and some people can't, and I do think that's closer. It's that in that case, there's too much of an analogy between like a parent-child relationship and a romantic partnership, because it's a child might need their parent to be there 24/7 in case they're freaking out or something like that. But even then, they're expected to sleep and go to school and have other caretakers and so on.
Right. And so what I'm saying is that each time you put a little injury like that into the trust, it actually takes a lot of time in order to rebuild it to where it was.
Okay. But
So something that's anti-fragile, it benefits from stress and volatility and adversity, but in the short term, it actually gets hurt, and it's only over the long time that it heals and becomes stronger than it was. And so what you need in a relationship is you need to be somewhat certain that the person is still going to be there, in the future, so that it's worth actually trying to heal that.
You definitely need some way to feel secure in a relationship if it's like a big part of your life, but it doesn't have to be measured in terms of like time commitments. For instance, like it's possible to feel secure in a relationship with somebody that you don't see that often, just due to other sort of the dynamics of the relationship.
Right, but there's a limit to how intimate you can be with that person, right?
I mean, I think where Chris has a point is I do kind of see that if there's a relationship that's so unstable that I can't trust in its longevity, I might limit my intimacy or investment in that relationship. And an example of that might be a relationship that was polyamorous or relationship anarchic in some way. Like if someone was out, dating and sleeping with all kinds of other people, I probably would limit in some, I don't know how. I'd limit in some way my investment.
Right, exactly. It's like almost certain that they're going to hurt you at some point.
I mean,
slut shaming.
No, I don't think that's.
I
okay.
would say so. Yeah. I mean, because you're assuming a correlation between promiscuity and lack of emotional investment. So that's slut shaming.
Well, I would assume a correlation between promiscuity and level of risk to the relationship. Level of risk that the other person falls for someone else, or that the relationship just doesn't last in some way.
Well, I mean, it's not.
I mean, what I'm saying is it's almost certain that they're going to choose somebody over you at some point.
Maybe that's like a form of low self-esteem, though, to believe that.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I think he means for like at least some amount of time they're going to choose to spend that time with someone else instead of you.
No, that's not what he's saying. You're saying there's a risk they're going to leave you for someone else permanently, right?
Yeah, or not, or you'll want to hang out with them, you'll want to do something with them, and they just won't be there. They'll be hanging out with somebody that they like better,
or that they already had plans with.
But I mean,
or
that
they like better for that particular thing that they're doing.
I mean, the objections you keep bringing up, Chris, are a little bizarre to me because it seems like they're sort of based on an assumption that someone's romantic partner should always give them time priority.
It's a common assumption.
I think it's more common than not.
Yeah, and I think it's unhealthy.
I agree. That's one of the assumptions that I don't rock with anymore. Like I don't conduct my relationships that way anymore.
I mean, there are people who live
I don't like that
way.
either.
Like I think sometimes people regress in sexual romantic relationships as a kind of test for parenthood, and we even like call each other baby and so on. It's like a test of how this person would be as a parent. And so I think sometimes people get locked in this phase of like testing their partner for parenthood, where it's like, well, if I were a baby, you'd have to be here for me all the time. So like, are you capable of that? But also there's the meta test of, are you capable of not testing your partner all the time and actually doing something rather than engaging in some tests,
I guess maybe what I'm getting at is that there are certain periods in your life where you're having a particular emotional experience, and whoever you share that particular emotional experience with, you're going to grow in intimacy with the relationship with that person is going to become stronger. But those opportunities are fleeting, and so if somebody that you really like and that you want to grow in intimacy with is not there while you're having that kind of fleeting experience, then you might never get a chance to actually increase your intimacy with that person.
Well, it's funny because I would say that because there are so many crucial experiences that can be so very fleeting, that's partly why you need relationships to be open, so you don't miss out on those fleeting experiences.
I mean, I also think that overexposure can kill passion.
Yeah.
I guess I don't see why monogamy versus non-monogamy is necessarily the issue there. Like, you could have a non-monogamous relationship where you share a home and you're raising kids together and you've agreed to be there in the evenings, every evening, generally, unless you're going out with somebody else. Or you could have a monogamous relationship where somebody's traveling 30% of the time for work. The issue the issues that you're bringing up seem to be issues of you're concerned about having a primary partner who's not going to be there most of the time. But that could be negotiated really either way, and it's not dependent on whether you're monogamous with them or not.
I mean, it is kind of dependent on societal frequency of monogamy versus non-monogamy, because, like, you might say, okay, this is about division of emotional labor, and you're worried about who's going to do the emotional labor that I need done in my life, and, like, if I don't have a primary partner or somebody who's, like, has this, like, nearly 24/7 commitment to my emotional needs, how will I make sure that they're met in a timely fashion or something like that? It's like, well, I mean, patience is part of it. But if you're in a society where everyone else has this obligation to other people, that means that they won't be able to give as much to you because everyone else is also expected to be available 24/7 for their partner. It's that scarcity is created by it being the de facto standard in all the other relationships.
I kind of agree with you on this one. Like, I feel it makes me think, like, when I was younger, I had a pattern of, like, if I had a crush on someone, I would sometimes, like, leave my schedule open, like, hoping that we would hang out or
I've never done
that. Go out Friday night. Anyway, eventually I just realized that that's, like, a really toxic pattern, and it comes from that same place of, like, putting certain relationships up on a pedestal.
I mean, it's occasionally strategic.
I guess my concern is less about time and more about emotional engagement. Maybe this kind of goes in with Chris's concern. Like, it's not the one way something like non-monogamy is different from just having a job where you travel a lot is, like, if you start having sex with somebody, there are biological primal things that happen that bond you together and kind of make you want to get with them and be with them all the time and have kids and stuff like if you're doing that, it's just it emotionally shakes up the other relationships in your life.
So for the sake of argument, what do you suppose happens biologically if someone has sex with two people in strict alternation? Not that I'm saying there's any reason to be that methodical in your life, but consider a thought experiment, because you're saying there's this biological inevitability that...
Okay, I don't know if this is for everybody, and I've never done anything like that strict, like in strict alternation, but in my experience, if I was dating multiple people at once, I didn't fall in love with either of them.
Okay, well, what if you were already in love with one of them? I mean, it's different if you fall in love at the same time over the same period of time with the two people. But I mean, I'm just saying, you're saying there's this biological inevitability. Well, it's certainly biologically possible to do what I just described, and then thered be a biological result psychologically. You're saying you think it will result in love for neither party. It's
love for neither party, or like for me, I find it when I had multiple partners who I was like very deeply emotionally engaged with at the same time, like when I had a long-term partner and then I was seeing somebody else at the same time, it kind of worked, but I found it to be very emotionally tumultuous, and like I'm being pulled over here and now I'm being pulled over here, and it was just a lot to deal with. Like it was just basically more than I want to deal with in terms of hormones and stuff.
Well, there's a question of how much emotion should we want to deal with, because, I mean, I'm certainly biased towards wanting to deal with a lot more emotion than most people, is what I found. And, you know, I like very emotional music and whatever, and we live in a arguably more unemotional society than, like, whatever our original state. And, you know, something, if you think of, like, a novel like Brave New World, where it's, like, very pathologized to show extreme emotion at all. Now, in that case, they seem to think that it's because, like, it's all spread out, so the emotion isn't deep, that, you know, you're just having a little bit of love with everybody, so you don't have that kind of deep love. But what you're describing, I think, is closer to the reality that you actually get more emotional depth from having multiple partners. And it sounds like what you're saying is that it's just too much emotion, and I'm saying, bring it on.
Well, for me, I wouldn't say it was more emotional depth, it was more emotional chaos, more emotional confusion. How
do we distinguish those exactly? I mean...
No, I guess I'm kind of wondering the same thing. Like, is it a profound experience to have sex with someone? I guess, like is it, or is it just like a like? I mean, I feel like Katie, almost like what you're saying could almost be like lead to a renunciation of casual sex if it's going to lead to a renunciation of multiple partners.
I mean, maybe, unless you're. I'm okay with having emotionally deep one night stands when I'm single. I'm okay with that from time to time.
Why are you okay with that, though, and not relationship anarchy, then?
I'm not okay with polyamory. I would call myself kind of a relationship agnostic who is choosing to be in a monogamous relationship. I mean, like, where I like, he's not open to being open either. It's just I don't always want to invite chaos in my life, but maybe sometimes I do.
I guess I'm trying to understand. Yes, so it's there's okay. So the argument is that basically having sex
invites chaos.
Yes.
Sex invites
but
chaos.
That's good.
Okay, so having sex invites chaos. Having sex with love or some kind of deep commitment invites chaos and depth.
Chaotic.
Having sex with new people invites chaos. Having sex with the same person over and over again is very low chaos.
Orderly and proper.
Well, I would say that chaos.
It's low chaos and can lead to great depth also. But then often for a lot of people, it gets really boring. And like, I've experienced that too. And I don't want that forever either.
Right, and I would say it gets boring when you reach the limit of how much you can use the relationship for personal development. I think if you pick the right person and you're both committed to personal development, that it should just continue infinitely. I don't see any reason why not.
Maybe. Well, I mean, maybe we're not wired for that.
I mean, personal development seems to benefit from additional perspectives, whether they're sexual or not. Maybe it's more chaotic in the sexual case, and like, you're certainly like you could be either a believer in strictly enforced monogamy, or you could be a complete slut. But either way, you still might go through a period where for personal development you need to have no sex at all, and that's nothing to do with being in favor of controlling your partner's relationships when you have partners or something like that. Suppose you need to not invite chaos for a while into your life, and you're like, okay, I'm not going to like start a new job. I'm not going to start a new relationship this month. I'm not going to like change my wardrobe today, like buy new clothes this month, because like I'm not going to make big changes in my life this month. That's could be a perfectly reasonable attitude for somebody to have, and they're just generally inviting less chaos at that moment because they're like, I got enough chaos, I got enough shit to deal with. And then you might reach a point where you're like, you know what, I could stand to invite some more chaos and learn a little more because I've kind of processed what I've taken on so far enough that I can invite some more chaos in my life. It doesn't have to be sexual chaos. It could be any political project.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I think another thing to mention here is just, it's not only that like you having sex with other people invites chaos. If somebody that you love has sex with someone else, that also invites chaos.
It invites more chaos if you're more dependent on them. It's not to say you shouldn't be dependent on your partners in any way. Obviously, there's an interdependency to like a romantic relationship, but it's less chaotic if you have more independence. Easier said than done, I know, but like,
yeah,
it's true of a lot of things.
Yeah, so I think maybe we can all agree that too much order is probably bad, and too much chaos is probably bad, and you need to kind of ride this line between order and chaos. And I think, obviously, so the argument against monogamy is that people get bored because there's too much order, and so they need to invite a little bit of chaos in order to spice things up and continue development. And the argument against things like polyamory and relationship anarchy is that it's too chaotic. And if you have too much chaos, then you can actually topple the order, and then you have to kind of start from the beginning.
Yeah, and I mean, I can sort of see it going the other way too. Like, to some extent, I could see, not that this is necessarily what relationship anarchy is, but I can see a situation where someone is just very promiscuous as potentially being less chaotic. Because I feel like after a certain time, like, you become desensitized. Whereas yeah. I kind of tend to think that like falling deeply in love with one person can be an extremely chaotic experience, and that the intensity and chaos of that can be curtailed if you're like hedging. I don't want to say hedging your bets, but a little bit like still keeping sort of anchors with other people.
It's also more chaotic if you fall in love with a second person when you already agreed not to, or something like that, as opposed to just, I'm falling in love with a second person. And similarly, like, the enforcement of the agreement can be very chaotic because it can breed jealousy. I mean, I was the most jealous that I've ever been in a monogamous relationship.
I mean, definitely the openness to sex with other people invites more chaos in my view. Like, I've definitely developed really strong feelings for people and fallen in love with people I haven't been having sex with, but I do think that having sex invites more of that kind of chaos.
Sure, I agree. I mean, I think I have a taste for chaos more than some. But I do think it's a matter of degree. I don't think you don't have to control your partner to be conservative necessarily how much chaos you invite in your life. You were saying earlier that it also invites chaos when your partner has a new partner or something like that. I mean, yeah. I wanted to get back to the topic of like limits to intimacy, because I forgot a dimension that I wanted to mention about that, and it kind of ties into this. So another limit to intimacy is just the limit of an external perspective in the first place. I don't know. I've gotten a lot of advice from people, from like friends and partners, and I've like sought out a lot of people's advice on decisions when like I couldn't possibly have told them enough of the situation for them to really give informed advice anyway, or something like that. And there's a real limit to how much an external perspective can give you when it comes to like, well, if we are going to talk about specifically personal development, then a lot of personal development is development that there's a limit to how much you're going to get that from an intimate connection with somebody else, because a lot of it's like your intimate relationship with yourself. So that's a limit to intimacy. Well, it doesn't speak to the question of mono versus poly at any rate.
Okay. Here's a question I have for I think all you guys. We're all talking about like how these like relationships get boring and limit that you reach an end to development, or an end like diminishing returns to how much you guys can help each other change.
I exactly said it. But go on.
Well, there's something like diminishing returns of new emotional and transformative opportunities in the relationships. Like why stay in those relationships? Why not just be serially monogamous?
Well, I think it's renewed by the new partners. Actually, one of the things I love to talk to people about is other people. So it gives you more to talk about.
Yeah, a couple things I would say. One, I think that sexuality can grow mundane before intimacy and emotional and personal development can grow mundane in a partnership. And like, I disagree with Chris when he said that he thinks that sex would continue to remain interesting necessarily if you had a strong, intimate relationship with someone emotionally. That was.
I never said it would necessarily keep getting better. I would say if both people are committed to making it better, then it should get and both people are trusting the process, then it should continue to get better.
You said you don't see why it wouldn't.
Right.
I see potential reasons why it would, and like I suspect that humans biologically are more inclined to serial monogamy than they are to long-term commitments or to polyamory.
Really?
Yes.
Wait, why?
Because that seems to be what everyone naturally does. Like
serial monogamy?
Serial monogamy with cheating, if left to their own devices, seems to be what people tend towards.
So serial polyamory?
Not really serial polyamory.
If it's with cheating, it's not monogamy, is it?
Well,
it's monogamy. It's nominally monogamy, but
sorry, we're getting some fun music from my neighbor, but we'll just roll with it. So I tend to see like people who aren't conscientious about their relationships. They're not really driven ethically towards not cheating, and they're not really thinking about relationship structures. The most common pattern in those types of people that I see is they fall really deeply in love with one person. They're just with them for a long time, and then they start cheating on them every once in a while, and then that sustains it for a while, and then they break up, and then they fall really in love with another person, and they're with them exclusively. And then they get bored, and then they start cheating, and then they break up.
Or there's another pattern, which is you have two primary people who are in a very long-term relationship, and every now and then they get bored with each other, and they introduce some chaos in order to spice things back up.
Some kind of drama.
Break up, make up.
That sort of does seem to be like, if we're going into like Evo Psych, like an evolutionarily advantageous structure for having and raising kids with some genetic variety, with some stability.
It's funny because I was going to say I didn't get the part where this was biological, because it's a common story, but there's a big social step in that story, which is when they start cheating on somebody, most people aren't informed of the alternative of having an open relationship. In fact, a lot of people are still in a social context where they would have a lot of social punishment for even raising the idea.
And yet, whether it's cheating or whether it's polyamory, in my experience, there tends to be a ton of jealousy, even among people who are like super with it.
Compersion.
The jealousy to me suggests a drive towards exclusivity, at least over a certain time frame.
Because you think the jealousy is biological?
Yes. I think jealousy is pretty natural.
Obviously, all our emotions are biological, like they evolve biologically or whatever. But is compersion also biological? Happiness that your partner found a new partner, let's say? I think that's biological.
I don't know. I was just going to say, in my experience, it takes like a lot of deep work for somebody to get to a point of compersion. And I'm not saying you shouldn't go for it or shouldn't do it, but I think there are very few people who are naturally compersive without going through a stage of really like rough jealousy.
I think people are naturally both. Like people have both drives, just like they have love and hate.
I guess there's like the cuckoldry thing.
Huh. You mean the cuckoldry fetish, you mean?
Yeah, the cuckoldry fetish, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, calling it a fetish, it's funny because, like, a fetish is supposed to have something wrong with it, otherwise it wouldn't be hot, So it's like, calling it a cuckoldry fetish is, like, still kind of mononormative, you know what I mean? Just like I don't think like freedom is a fetish. I think slavery is a fetish, and freedom is not a fetish.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, like if you care about somebody and
I think monogamy is
they're experiencing happiness that that basically you can't provide them, then yeah, there's a kind of like conflicted happiness. It's like, well, I wish I could provide that happiness, but if I can't, I'd rather it be there than it not be there.
No, I mean, that's an interesting assumption that you would assume that somebody would wish that they could provide the happiness, because like,
I mean, I would. I mean, maybe we're all just different and we all have different preferences. But yeah, my thought would be like, oh man, like I wish I could provide that type of happiness. But at the same time, like if I can't, then I'm happy that they found that happiness outside of external to me somehow.
I mean, it's I don't know. To me, it's similar to how my wife told me that I wasn't one of her biggest musical influences, and I was like, well, that's good. I want to be one of your musical influences. I definitely don't want to be one of your biggest musical influences, because then it'll be difficult for you to influence me musically, because I would be too much of your musical influence. Right.
I mean, that's a piece of your identity that you've you could be kind of like owning it as your identity, and if that's the case, then it would hurt if somebody was giving you information that told, like, if you think you're good at something and somebody tells you that you're bad at it, then that hurts, But if you don't think that you're good at it and somebody tells that you're bad at it, then you're like, well, that's not a part of me anyway, so I'm not hurt.
I don't think anybody could be good at that, though. I don't think there's a way to be good at being, let's say, your partner's only musical influence and also have them be a good musical influence for you.
Well, that's not really what I mean. It's not a part of your identity to be somebody's only influence on something, but it could be a part of your identity to be good at a particular thing.
I think kind of what we're getting at here is there's the all and the one, right? Like from the two perspectives. Like from the perspective of the all, I just want all people to be happy, and if there's someone I like, I just want them to be happy with who they are, and I want myself to be happy too, but I'm not more important than other people. So there's the perspective of the all, and then there's the perspective of the one. And from the perspective of the one, that's like the ego. My ego self, like, I want to be happy and I want to be special to someone else. And these days the perspective of the ego is kind of denigrated. Is what the Eastern philosophy has become popular, but I think there's something to both.
Right. I mean, picture from like an incel's perspective. Like, if an incel, considers themselves to be not worthy of procreation or something like that, are they supposed to feel happy for the people who are worthy of procreation in their view, and happy with basically being relegated to the reproductive sidelines? That's kind of how I see compersion. It's like a lesser version of that.
Well, you started that example by saying if they really believed that they're not worthy. So if they really believed it, then yeah, like if you think that you're evil and like your spawn will be the next Hitler, then like you should be happy that you don't give birth to the next Hitler or something.
I mean, should you?
But the real issue is people who don't believe that. Let's consider the issue of people who don't believe that, who think like society is unjust. I am deserving of sexual intimacy and I should get into the next generation. Actually, I remember the relevance of the example I was thinking of. So I was thinking an example earlier of like, example comes up in like like the idea of coercive labor in society in general. Like, suppose we're a nation of 100 people in an island and like one child becomes orphaned in an accident and someone has to take care of the child. And in a sense, if no particular adult was willing to, there'd be some kind of social coercion of like, well, somebody's got to do it. So like it becomes socially distributed labor, or somebody steps up and they foster the child or whatever. And you might say that child, society has an obligation to them that they deserve parental love and that sort of thing. And even just for the sake of society, so they develop into somebody who's like a healthy person. Now take that to an adult person who is like an incel, like in your example. And instead of it being children without parents, it's, let's say, men without wives. And in that case, people are inclined to give a different answer. Now, some people might say, no, the child doesn't deserve parents either, like, survival of the fittest or something like that. Some people might go completely Spartan, literally that way. And some people might go in the extreme the other direction and say, no, even the adult men have, you have to address the love inequality and they are entitled to love. Therefore, I've seen some people say, oh, well, therefore the state should fund prostitutes for people. Or, in fact, I was just reading a Stanford article where they get into the limits to how much you can exclude people from society. And they're like, well, we can just solve this with robots. One day robots will give people love. And I was like, what? It kind of misses the entire point of love as a communicative act. It's not just like a physical service. Like, what are you talking about? But anyway, I mean, like, how much perspective are they going to get from the love of the robot? They're going to get the robot's perspective, I guess, or the perspective of the programmer. Anyway, that's not off topic. But
yeah.
So like, you might say children are entitled to parental love, but men aren't entitled to romantic love. And, that there's a difference there, that the incel argument is acting like an entitled child rather than an adult who has to earn the respect of others or something like that.
Right. And what's happening there is that the incel is being asked to subordinate their own fundamental primal drives to the needs of the collective.
Yes.
Can't you make that same argument for any system of welfare, though?
How's so?
That anyone who demands
assistance
or some kind of to be taken care of by the collective is in some way demanding an infantilized role.
Well, you might think that, like, a right to housing and a right to sex are very different. You might think a right to sex is absurd, and you might think a right to housing is like... That seems like today's, like, what most people would say today. In principle,
it is what most people would say today. I'm just wondering, like, what is the justification for that distinction?
Sex involves another person's perspective in a way that housing doesn't. Like,
I for the record, I definitely wouldn't say that housing is a right.
Really?
Really. Like, unless you build it or earn it somehow, like, I don't think you have the right to a shelter, no.
I'm aware of rights language in the first place. It's kind of like a way to simplify it. But, like, if somebody is homeless, all else being equal, society should devote resources until they're not homeless. Unless
they're crazy and impossible to house somehow, unless they're very destructive and they destroy the housing that they're in. I mean,
if someone is crazy, all else being equal, society should devote resources to their mental health. And
assuming those resources exist.
Are these arguments consequentialist, though? Like, it's better for society to do that? Or are they, like, first principle, like they have a right to care and housing?
Well, I was trying to switch to saying all else being equal, resources should be devoted instead of saying they have a right. Because rights do sound very absolute, and then what do you do when they come into conflict when the resources are finite?
Right, exactly.
But I would say all else being equal, resources should be devoted to making sure all people are housed. Now, okay, what if you said all else being equal, resources should be devoted to making sure all people get laid? I mean, but
that logic, a smart political strategy by incels would be to just become extremely violent and disruptive to the point where it's in the interest of society to give in to their demands.
Well, yeah, and clearly all people should not get laid. Like there are some people that probably should not reproduce. Like, it would actually be harmful for society for that person to reproduce.
Which is not true of parental love. I don't think there's people where it's good for society for them to not receive parental love, because if they don't, they might grow up into those people who shouldn't reproduce. Or at least who shouldn't rear a parent. I definitely
agree that children are a different category. It's not totally clear to me that from first principles.
Maybe that's the distinction being made, like, or a way that we could make the distinction between what kinds of things society should devote resources to. Like you said, Chris, like, there are some people that it would cause really negative consequences if they did get laid and reproduce. But I don't know if we could say the same thing, that there are people for which there would be extreme negative consequences if they had a shelter.
I disagree. I think that, again, if a person is very destructive to the shelter that they are put in, then it doesn't make sense to try to put them into a shelter. Or maybe it makes sense to try, but then if they're destructive to that housing, then society is basically just wasting resources in order to try and house that person.
I mean, I don't know. I don't like these consequentialist arguments, because it seems to me it'd be really easy for incels to just take a political strategy of, like, altering the value proposition. Like, they could say, we'll get sterilized if you provide us with free prostitutes or whatever. But if you don't, then we're gonna riot. That's part. A lot of the reason why we have workers' rights and stuff is because people protested.
Yeah, I mean, that's how reality works, though. I mean, the people play with the different incentives, and sometimes the incentives are threats of physical violence.
I mean, you might find that these incels aren't actually satisfied with prostitutes anyway if they feel like it's only because of government regulation that they're receiving affection.
Oh, totally. It's going to be like
exactly. It's
going to be an escalating thing. Now we want
escalator.
Now we want the girlfriend experience. Now we want wives.
Yeah.
Legitimate freedom of our partners. We're involuntary prostitute users.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, this is ugly to say, but it also tends to go similarly when you talk about giving people rights to things like food and housing and working conditions. People demand more and better over time. I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but that same dynamic occurs.
Yeah, and then either society gives it to them, or the society collapses into revolution.
Okay, but like living in a house doesn't require the house's perspective the way living in a relationship with someone requires the person's perspective, right? So like there's an inherent loss of perspective in the state just being like, we're going to provide you a partner, because like part of the beauty of a relationship is that it's two perspectives coming together, of their own free will, if you believe in that.
I guess part of it also is like we treat labor as fungible in our society, which maybe is a problem. But you know, the worker who built the house for the government social housing is satisfied to do that as long as he gets paid.
This isn't social housing.
Well, no, I know, it's not. But I mean, you know, the workers that built this house
just
for
Kensington. It looks like it.
The workers that build like a private dwelling versus workers that build a public dwelling, in both cases, are satisfied to do that because they get paid in money, and money is fungible and labor is fungible. Whereas,
I don't think labor is perfectly fungible.
I mean, certain kinds of labor are fungible. Other types of labor are not fungible.
Sex is less fungible. Sex work is not the most fungible work.
Yeah.
I mean, that could be a criticism. That's a criticism of capitalism, right? That we treat all work as fungible. We treat value as fungible.
Well, again, some work is fungible. Like basically, the more supply of a certain type of labor there is, the more fungible it is. So the fewer people there are that can do a particular type of labor, the less fungible it is, because you have to get one of those few people.
And everyone's unique, so like connecting to a person is not very fungible.
It shouldn't be, although if this incel political movement begins, it will definitely.
Yeah, with all the state-sanctioned prostitutes.
One question that's been coming up for me, this was kind of a while back when you were talking about relationship anarchy and how you felt that it would be better for society if people had more intimate connections. There's an argument, Jordan Peterson makes this argument in favor of monogamy, that it has a stabilizing role within society. Specifically, he argues that having some kind of socially enforced monogamy reduces the incidence of incels and like helps contain the spread of frustrated male violence, because it seems like there's a historical tendency that when there is free love or when monogamy isn't socially enforced, there seems to be a tendency of many women dating one man. Which would result in more incels. So
I just rewatched this argument from Jordan, and I mean, the simple answer is that that's negotiating with terrorists. I mean, incels are terrorists in a sense. I mean, maybe not under every legal definition. There's an interesting article in Now Magazine, actually, about whether incels are terrorists. Anyway, but let's say it's a kind of terrorism, misogynistic terrorism. And to say that if we don't do what the terrorists want, they'll get violent that's negotiating with terrorists. So like, and you can also view it as victim blaming, saying that like, oh, men will get violent if we don't do this. It's like, well, that's unjustified violence. So like, that's the problem.
I mean, yeah, but sometimes the violence happens anyway, and it's extremely harmful to society.
Like, if those guys are going to get violent because they're jealous of other dudes getting laid too much, we better stand up to those men who want to be violent for those reasons.
Well, I mean, I don't think that's the only criticism, though, of...
Not the only. That's the particular
but
there.
Yeah, but the argument... I think you can frame the argument in such a way that, like, the major factor isn't, trying to contain the violence of incels. Like part of what Jordan Peterson argues is basically that kind of allowing hypergamy to, like, flourish in that way is bad for all involved. Like, it's bad for it's bad for the masses of men who remain single. It's not great for the women who don't get a one-on-one relationship, and it's not good for the men who get laid a bunch either, because they basically get overwhelmed by sex and become cynical.
I mean, if we have a modern society that like protects people from like a lot of threats of death, and like everybody always has a child, then like the rate of evolution actually slows down. It's good that not everybody has a child. Otherwise, the only evolution is evolution of ideas. So like that's not actually bad. It's bad if it gets extreme. But you're not supposed to be entitled to have a child because like maybe your perspective doesn't gel with somebody else's and you wouldn't create a good co-parenting environment.
Your objection to this argument so far seems to be, okay, we don't want to negotiate with terrorists. We don't want to negotiate with incels. But do you agree with kind of the setup for Jordan Peterson's argument that if monogamy was not socially enforced, we would probably see more like things that were closer to polygamy?
Well, I think what you mean is polygyny, having one man having many wives, and it wouldn't necessarily be marital either. But I mean, let's say that's an empirical question.
Yeah.
Because I'd be inclined to say, well, that's probably just an artifact of historical misogyny. That's the societal way of answering that line of thinking, is saying, well, yeah, that's just because historically women haven't been given the same freedom as men. And lately we've been giving men as little freedom as we've given women. Why don't we try giving both genders the same freedom that men had in a lot of historical contexts in the first place.
Well, I would definitely push back against that argument. I don't think it's just because of like sociocultural factors of women not being as free as men. I think that if you look at the numbers of, and we talked about this on the incel episode that may or may not be published soon, women are hypergamous. They're only attracted to, women are much more hypergamous than men. Women, like OkCupid did this study where basically women rated 85% of men as below average attractiveness, whereas men rated about half of women above average and about half below average.
Could also be a semantic difference, but go on.
And so what this leads to, and this is not, I don't think this is sociocultural. I don't see a way that could be sociocultural. And so what that leads to is it leads to a very, very few elite men getting the vast majority of the women. And you don't just see this in humans. You see this in, primates. You see this in other forms of animals. I mean, this is not sociocultural.
Well, other primates have different patterns than humans do when it comes to this stuff. So if it is biological, it actually wouldn't be that deep because both our closest relatives, bonobos and chimpanzees, have different patterns in this regard.
Right, but I would imagine that there are in both groups, and maybe we can check this, but I would guess that there are still a few males that get most of the sex and most of the reproduction, and then there the vast majority of the males get either some or none.
I'm going to fact check that because I'm not sure that's the case in bonobos. It is the case in chimpanzees, but also chimpanzees aren't female choice isn't a major factor in chimpanzee reproduction. It's male. It's basically male. Male rape, basically. They take the female chimpanzees that they want. And in bonobos, I'm not sure what the incidence of monogamy is or not in bonobo relationships, but I do know.
I'm not sure about our closest relatives, bonobos and chimpanzees, and their patterns. But I did. There's an online course that you can find on YouTube. It's Bob Sapolsky at Stanford on human behavioral evolution, and in that he basically says that there's generally two patterns in nature about mating strategies. There's one pattern of pair bonding, and there's another pattern of kind of an 80-20 where 20% of the males mate with 80% of the females, and there's a significant portion of males who don't reproduce at all. Because basically males have significantly lower costs for reproduction. They can kind of employ a spray and pray strategy. So it makes sense for them to mate with a lot of females, and it makes sense for females who have to actually gestate to try to mate with the highest potential males that they can. And in that, he said that most biologists agree, though it's debated, that humans fall somewhere between those two extremes or can maybe adapt to the different modes of reproduction depending on the resources available in the society.
Right, and it's kind of clear to me why this might lead to instability in society, because then you have, a very small portion of the males reproducing most of the children, and so they don't actually have time to help raise those children. So the women end up taking care of the children,
or the other men. They can have a job as a teacher. You don't have to have a kid to be a teacher.
Well, but I mean, there's a lot of evidence that single parenthood is really bad for kids.
Right, but what we're talking about here is more of a communal context in the first place. Originally, I think being raised by just two adults is also not as good as having more adult perspectives.
I think that's probably true, and there's also not a lot of evidence that consciously chosen single parenthood is worse for kids than dual parent households. There's a lot of evidence about how things work out on average.
I guess we're not necessarily talking about chosen single motherhood. We're more talking about a situation where women either have the choice of being part of a harem or raising their kid alone, or if they have the choice of, or basically where a small number of men are having casual sex with a lot of women, impregnating some of them and not committing to those women. So women are raising kids alone, which really doesn't seem better to me than monogamy does.
Right.
Well, I guess there would be an alternative, though, of having more community links, right? Like polyamory and relationship anarchy often leads to a kind of network of intimate relationships where you're connected to your metamors, and it's kind of going back a little bit to tribalism.
You can have party parenting without sexual promiscuity. Like they're not logically neither entails the other.
This is also like probably part of the reason why like women are like sexually fluid, like more likely to be bisexual, is like historically, if a woman ended up in that situation of like having kids and like not having a male partner, then like connecting sexually with other women in the same situation would be advantageous.
Well, and there's situational homosexuality in men, maybe, so it has the same. I mean, let's consider a different argument that is like a similar kind of structure, but it's like completely different. Women should have careers because of feminism, or however you want to frame it, and having children is sometimes framed as like at odds with having a career. And if, say, a family wants to have more than one child, but wants to not compromise the mother of the first child's career, that child being with a second mother means that there's, more adult labor that can go into jobs and I guess bringing money into the household per child, right? Because in that case, there's 3 adults and 2 children rather than 2 adults and 2 children. So there's more time left over for the adults to pursue their careers. Right.
It would definitely be interesting to see like numbers on, like we've looked at numbers on single parents versus 2-parent households. It'd be interesting to look at the numbers on like intentional communities and like polyamorous kind of co-parenting to see if that leads to good outcomes for children.
But as much as like I love empirical data and everything, I'm kind of I feel like I want to raise a question mark about how much we should make these kinds of personal decisions based on the numbers. You know what I mean? Like I don't know. Like that's not how I arrived at any of these conclusions. I didn't look at the numbers and be like, oh, this is how I should feel. You know what I mean? Like.
I mean, you don't believe in testing your models in actual reality?
Well, I just think the first test is their lived experience. Like, for instance, in the numbers about like how often animals are promiscuous, like they had it wrong about pigeons for a long time, for instance, right? Because like, it turns out the data is noisy, but I think it's a lot easier to get it wrong about pigeons than it is to get it wrong about who you love, because you have more direct access to your own emotions, your own feelings than you do about how pigeons feel. And it turns out, because I was going to say earlier, because you can combine pair bonding with promiscuity, and that's actually what pigeons do. They pair bond and they're promiscuous. And I think you could make an argument that a society without pair bonding is like bereft in various ways. And like, pair bonding is very important. But to me, they can go together well.
I guess to get back a little bit to this children question, like we were talking before, we were very much characterizing, or at least for the most part, we were characterizing relationship anarchy and polyamory as being the chaotic side of the relationship spectrum and the more variable side. Well, that's kind of my question is like, there is a lot of evidence that stability is really good for children. It's really important for children's mental health as they grow up. Do you think like a relationship anarchic framework is compatible with providing a stable environment for children? Well,
if you already have a single parent, it's more serial monogamy is kind of destabilizing compared to. I mean, let me put it this way: the mononormative paradigm sometimes forces the ends of relationships by being very all or nothing, and that I think can be damaging to children because if your parent has to completely break up with the person they don't want to fuck anymore to meet somebody else, then that person is maybe completely out of your life because of the all or nothing nature of the monogamous setup that they're forced into serial monogamy, as opposed to maybe that relationship will change, or maybe it's they just don't want to see them as often because they want to make room to get to know this new person or whatever, and. In fact, maybe that would give that other adult more time to parent the child while that adult is getting to know somebody else.
That's a good point. I like one thing that I like about relationship anarchy, and I don't know if this is a tenet of it, but I've tended to notice it within polyamorous and relationship anarchist communities is like more talk of relationship transitioning rather than breakups.
Yeah, and like avoiding the so-called relationship escalator. And, it's really difficult in practice, but I'm still hopeful in the idea that by people being more flexible, it means that the ends or like relationships won't have as many all or nothing ends, and that there's more de-escalation and smoother transitions. And, reality is not so simple, but sometimes it's simpler in that way. Sometimes if you're not forced into all or nothing decision, it's just like you need to have a dramatic breakup with that person, you just need to not see them as much or something like that. It happens that way sometimes.
Can you define relationship escalator? You use that. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, so it's linked in the wiki on relationship anarchy. There's a couple articles you'll find. It's pretty associated with relationship anarchy, but it's like the relationship escalator is the idea that like your relationship escalates from each step to the next. And then if you go back a step, that's bad. And if you go up a step, that's good. And if you get stuck at a step, that's bad. And you're supposed to get as far up the escalator as you can. And you might ask, is this relationship go anywhere? Are we going to reach the top of the escalator? You know?
Yeah, well, that kind of reminds me of integration and differentiation, kind of maybe in a Jungian type thing, where if you have these certain stages of development, and you do want to try to get higher and higher and higher on the ladder, but if you miss, if you kind of don't do one enough, then you have to kind of regress until you integrate that stage of development, and then you can progress from there.
Well, yeah, and you can deconstruct the metaphor in various ways. For certain purposes, maybe you do need to escalate. Like if your goal is a co-parental situation with somebody, then you need a certain level of mental depth to be good parents together, I think. But lots of other connections wouldn't require escalation for any particular reason.
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. There's something about this that seems a little bit like this is where it seems a little bit like at odds with passion for me. Like there's something about like if a relationship is intense enough,
it's difficult to de-escalate.
Then it is all or nothing. At a certain point, it's all or nothing.
I said difficult. I didn't say impossible.
Well, it's almost like this idea, like
some escalators are really fast, and you end up jumping off in order to try to get back. Because you're like, this escalator's going too fast.
Well, it's almost like this idea, maybe that is one form of de-escalation that we do kind of talk about in our society is like, let's be friends. It didn't work out, but let's be friends. Let's go for coffee. Let's still talk.
That can be a euphemism, of course.
Yeah. And I mean, people do that, and I've done that. But I mean, I feel like I've only been able to do that in the relationships that are less intense.
Well, but I think what you could, that might be a euphemism for like, let's slow things down. And like maybe if we spend a longer time in this phase of the relationship, maybe the phase will actually, we'll be able to build a strong enough foundation to go somewhere even higher than we would have otherwise.
That's not what I was thinking. I was thinking more like a couple that breaks up and then tries to be friends after. So there's not really an intention of getting back together. Like that is a form of de-escalation.
Yeah, I share your experience with that. Like trying to de-escalate an extremely intense romantic relationship and then be close friends afterwards seems incredibly difficult, if not, well, I don't want to say it's impossible. Nothing's impossible, but it's extremely emotionally challenging to the point where I suspect that this is like why I suspect that we are more inclined towards serial monogamy than anything else, or serial monogamishness than anything else.
Let me interject here, because you might say that it makes it easier to be friends with somebody that you've been involved with sexually because you know them on that level. Obviously, there's another way in which it makes it more difficult, but is the way in which it makes it more difficult, does that outweigh the way in which it makes it easier to connect with somebody, right? And I think I do think it's good for society in like a information preserving kind of way that there's more opportunities for people to stay close after, say they de-escalate sexually, because there's multiple escalators at once, right? It might be that you do it de-escalate sexually, but you actually form a better friendship than you had before. Certainly possible.
Okay, this is the thing about like relationship anarchy contrasted to like a Jordan Petersonian kind of way of Petersonian way of looking at it. Like I feel like relationship anarchy, like part of the appeal of it is it's like it's like a bit of like a have it all kind of thing. Whereas a Petersonian is more you have to make sacrifices.
You do have to make sacrifices.
It's like do we have infinite love, or do we have? I don't know. I read this paper by Jung a while ago where he basically like likens relationships to like entropy systems.
Okay.
Where at the beginning of a relationship you're very low entropy, and then as a relationship progresses, like low entropy, high potential, and then as a relationship progresses, you use up the potential and the entropy increases, and past a certain point, there's nothing left. There's nothing left.
This is like, I don't know if it's in the same passage when he talks about a relationship being like a chemical reaction and both people are transformed. And so you're like two chemicals that react, eventually there's no more reaction. But then those chemicals are going to go in other chemical environments and other reactions, and it's not necessarily sexual or romantic, but it could be. And, when you see your favorite chemical tomorrow, they're already a different chemical, so there's another reaction.
That's an interesting point.
So one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the relationship of the masculine to the feminine, and it seems to me that, and Peterson talks about this all the time, that they kind of have this vague relationship to order and chaos. And I did spend a few years of my life identifying as an anarchist because I was like, well, obviously I like freedom, and I noticed that my thoughts were free, but I wasn't really that free. Like I was able to think whatever I wanted, which was great, but like I didn't experience a higher degree of freedom in my life. And then I noticed and Peterson kind of influenced me on this front as well, that introducing a little more discipline into my life and responsibility into my life actually vastly increased the amount of freedom that I was experiencing. And it's almost like the masculine is this kind of structure that orders things so that the feminine can actually be more free than it would otherwise be. And so that's kind of the hang up I have with relationship anarchy. It seems like, well, we're just going to have relationships and there's going to be no structures. And while that sounds like a good idea on paper, it might actually lead to less freedom than like having a definite structure, because as I was arguing earlier, that to me, it seems like it provides more predictability, it provides more stability, and it provides this kind of safe home base that you can explore the world from, instead of kind of always wondering what's going to happen next, and you're not able to make long-term plans.
This gets back to anarchy as a method rather than like the state of no state, because it's not that there would be no structure, it's just that the structure that emerges in relationships would be a process of people questioning power differences actively throughout the process of that structure emerging. So like, if you're skeptical of power differences, but you still allow some of them when they're justified, because you might say like, well, I spend more time with this person because like we're planning on starting a family, and like this other person, you know, they have other plans with somebody else, and there's like a reason for that difference. You know, there might be another case where it's like, actually, there is no reason. Why do I spend more time with this person? Maybe I should spend close to equal time with those two people. That isn't necessarily restricted to romantic relations.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is I think there's an importance to actually sacrificing something in order to provide more stability. I think that's the kind of more masculine side of the equation. It seems like relationship anarchy is very strong on the feminine side of the equation, but there isn't much of that sort of masculine side.
Well, I was going to say earlier about the predictability thing that I found it got a lot easier to practice polyamory when I started being clearer with myself and clearer with other people that it was a permanent decision, that I wasn't in danger from their perspective of converting to monogamy with somebody else. Because this is a frequent situation. It's like, oh, I'm going to do open relationships. And like, actually, I met somebody else who I really want to be with them, and they insist on monogamy. So they're making me give up this other relationship. And people do it because they're like, I'll do whatever's necessary to get person X because they're into them or whatever. And I mean, I think as a form of collective action, everyone should say no in those situations and be like, no, I want the person who isn't going to make me cut off ties with somebody.
I mean, isn't that kind of gets into like doing some of these relationship anarchy readings? There was a lot of people being critical of like making commitments to the future, or like making making contracts that limit our future behavior.
Yeah, I'm not really on board with that part of it. I think I know some of the parts of those readings you're talking about. I think commitment is really great. I think it's really unfortunate how people equate promiscuity with lack of commitment, or they equate relationship anarchy or polyamory with lack of commitment. You know, in some ways, I think relationships being open, more flexible, actually allows for more commitments, because you can stay more committed to your, let's say, your past partners or your partners where the relationship is de-escalated. You know, those past commitments you can actually still honor in ways you can't if you're expected to cut off ties with people that you were too intimate with in the past.
I think that that's changing, though, even within norms in monogamy. I think that a lot of people, especially in our generation, are no longer expecting or requiring people to cut off friendships that used to be sexually or romantically intimate in the past. I know that's something that I would definitely say no to.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that's true. I mean, sometimes I manage to be blissfully unaware. Then remember, there's lots of social contexts that are just like the social context I grew in, where you're not supposed to even raise the idea of relationship anarchy. And, anarchy itself, just politically, there's a lot of amnesia about that, and sort of sabotaging of the concept of equating it with chaos and so on. We're kind of doing it here, saying like, oh yeah, like fucking a lot of people is chaos. It's like, well, it really depends what kind of those relationships are like. Some relationships are more stabilizing. And actually another example is like, it can be stabilizing if, suppose you're in a relationship that would have been unstable without an outside perspective that you weren't likely to get outside of a certain kind of relationship. Because sometimes you can notice from being in two relationships that, like, maybe in that case, for once, it's not your fault, it's that somebody else is acting poorly. You can tell from the contrast between the relationships. And you might forget if all of the control cases you have are in the past. It's easy to forget what it's like to be in a healthy relationship when you're in an abusive relationship. But if you're in both at the same time, it's a lot more obvious.
Yeah.
And that can be less chaos, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's interesting.
Another way that it might be able to be stable or stable-ish, like for raising children, is in monogamy, like the unit of stability is two people together. If you're a relationship anarchist or polyamorous, you might have the unit of stability being like a polycule, or like a loose group of interconnected relationships, which maybe some people will break up and some people will people will move in and out of it. But like, I've seen stable, more or less groups of people, kind of like groups of friends. Like, you'll have a new friend, one friend moves, but the core group remains stable. And I think that that kind of a thing could provide a stable environment for children if executed well. But there's so much reactions going on when you throw sex and love into the mix.
Yeah, but you know, if you have a group of friends, and we've all seen the show Friends, there will be sex and love thrown into the midst. And, you know, of course, on the show, it was written in that it wouldn't break up the peer group. But if you have more flexibility in the way you can de-escalate relationships, it actually makes it possible to reduce the instability that comes from breakups, fracturing peer groups, which I've seen a million times from every angle. And it's...
I actually have seen situations of like children being raised in a kind of context where instead of having a nuclear family, there's like a community or like a group of friends who kind of like
parents
satellite the child, I guess, like orbit around the child and like contribute a lot in like almost like a aunt or uncle kind of role. And it definitely it's hard to gauge. Like it seemed like the kids were okay and they definitely got a lot of value from that structure that would have been absent if it had just been a single parent. Like it was definitely a lot better than that. But there also were situations where there was like conflicts among the adults, and adults that had previously been very important to the child were no longer part of the child's life. And, you know, this parent had kids that the child used to play with all the time, and now there's a fight, and now the child doesn't see those children anymore. And the children were definitely like sad about it, and it impacted them when stuff like that happened.
But the fact that a fight between the adults means that the child doesn't see the adult isn't a consequence of relationship anarchy. It's actually a consequence of too little relationship anarchy, because if there was truly free association, then the child might say to the adult, maybe one of their biological parents, well, screw you, I still want to, you know, go to the movies with Bob. I used to take them to see the Star Wars movies.
I mean, that's life, though. That's life.
That children don't
when a child is like 5, like that's life. When the adults stop talking, the child loses the relationship always.
But I think we have a lot of progress to make socially in terms of how much say children have in their social relationships, period, not just with other adults, with other children.
I find myself wondering, and I'm not sure, I'm not coming to any conclusions here, but how much of the trauma of like losing important relationships like that is due to the way that our society frames it. I see why it's really traumatic if you have a nuclear family and half of it leaves, it breaks up. I see why that's completely traumatic. But on the other hand, I'm thinking of a lot of other situations that are pretty normalized in our society. Like, for example, kids go to school and they change teachers every year. And losing the teacher, I mean, it was hard for me when I had a new teacher, but I didn't consider it traumatic, and I don't think it's a trauma that we usually consider. Kids are generally expected to lose great grandparents if they're in their lives, and that's something that like happens, and it's traumatic and it's sad, but also learning about loss is important and good for kids. Most kids have friends move at some point.
It's hard to be the kid who moves. Like it's almost a thing, but like the difference between like hormetic stress and traumatic stress. Hormetic, like a little bit of stress is good. Like going to the gym and working out is good. Working in a coal mine is bad. Having a friend move and learning loss in that way is probably like good stress. Being the kid to move and losing all your friends, like I was that kid, it was extremely difficult.
Right. The difference is that in one case, the loss is in the context of a larger structure which is stable, and in the other case, the loss causes the structure to destabilize.
Right. I guess it's kind of a question: is can and do stable structures emerge from relationship anarchy?
Well, certainly, if that just means from the process of questioning power differences in relationships, then yeah, because I mean, some of those power differences you question might be sources of instability, right? Because like when there is a power difference, that it's almost like potential energy, right? Like suppose there's a power difference between the parents. I mean, it doesn't have to be polyamory. You know, you can apply relationship anarchy in the case of the nuclear family as well, and say question the power difference between the father and the mother. If there's a big power difference, and say one is very domineering over the other, well, that actually makes the relationship unstable. The relationship might collapse. It could turn to domestic violence or whatever. And that's bad for the child in all sorts of ways. And if that power difference isn't questioned aggressively enough, it might grow and create that instability. So like that's applying relationship anarchy to the nuclear family. But you might mean polyamory specifically.
Yeah, I think I mean polyamory specifically. And I guess I was never quite clear on that question of, do you think that monogamy is oppressive?
Well, I don't think accidental monogamy is oppressive unless it's very widespread, in which case then we're politically too disconnected.
But chosen monogamy.
It's funny because I was going to say enforced, which is not the same as chosen. if you chose it, nobody has to enforce it, do they? I think monogamy is frequently oppressive, and I think mononormativity is oppressive, the idea that it's the default kind of relationship. I don't think accidental monogamy is necessarily oppressive, but I think it's oppressive if it's too widespread. I think mere introversion is oppressive. If like everybody's introverted, then we are more oppressible because we're not, united we stand, divided we fall.
Do you think two people agreeing to get into a monogamous relationship is oppressive in some way?
What does the agreement look like? I mean,
we're going to date each other and we can't sleep with anyone else or date anyone else.
I think if everybody did that, it's oppressive on a collective level.
Do you think it's oppressive for individuals to do that? Let's say in this context.
Or maybe unhealthy. Do you think that it's indicative of authoritarianism?
Well, I did say that I thought monogamy was a fetish. Maybe that's closer to what I think than saying that it's oppressive. Maybe not every fetish is oppressive, but I think of it more like a kink relationship now, to be honest. After many years out of monogamy, to me, it seems really kinky to be monogamous.
Okay.
It's a control fetish, like a power play, is how I view it. The answer, and frankly, I don't know if BDSM is healthy or when it's healthy. Exactly. I think it's very difficult. I actually wrote Chomsky about this question. One of his assistants wrote me back saying, "No, I can't address this question." I think it's a difficult question, and partly because it's not discussed very much. I'm inclined to flip the question on you guys and ask if any of you have a stronger opinion than I do about whether BDSM is healthy. Because maybe you don't accept the premise that monogamy is kinky, but if it is, then is it healthy to have power play in the first place? Should we fetishize power?
I mean, if both partners are willing participants.
I think kink is healthy often.
I think if both parties agree to do it and they have safe words and all that, then I see no reason why they shouldn't do it.
It certainly depends on why they agree, right? Like, suppose somebody was raised in an oppressive way, they didn't have access to enough information, and say it was before the internet or something, and they didn't know that there were relationships other than dom-sub relationships, then they're not making an informed choice, even if they chose it themselves, right?
Yeah, and I kind of think that's almost what's happening today, where like when you see like in the age of porn, certain types of sex, let's say like kinky, like are certainly very violent in one direction, often the direction of the man towards the woman, have become almost like normalized. I am concerned about that.
I think it's still significantly less common than vanilla relationships, though. So,
I mean, stuff like...
there's also non-consensual violence as well.
And just, I mean, like stuff like anal sex among teenagers, which is like, yes, people are free to choose whatever. But I mean, in my view, that's clearly become common because of porn. Like there's a correlation, and it's something that's often not pleasurable at all for the woman. I get that. Like it is concerning to me. It does concern me. Yeah,
it's a hugely biased sample that people are getting from porn. Like you might say, like, oh, they're more informed now because they didn't even know all the sex.
I mean, all right. So first of all, I've definitely heard that anal can be pleasurable for the woman. It probably often isn't when performed, but when performed correctly, it can. I think there's it's sort of an acquired taste. I don't think maybe you'll like it the first time, but that's neither here nor there. But the other thing I was going to say though is that like you're making it sound, Adam, you're making it sound like people are making these choices because they're not informed of the alternatives, and I think they're making these choices because they're bored with the alternatives, and they find the kinky stuff more exciting and less boring.
I definitely chose monogamy in the past due to a lack of me being informed. Maybe everyone else is more enlightened than I was when I was younger, but it's definitely true in my case that a lack of information made me biased towards monogamy.
Sure, I guess monogamy maybe, but BDSM, like are people choosing BDSM and dominance and submission because they're unaware of the alternatives? I don't think that's an argument that you can make.
I think they are in a lot of cases. I mean, I used to date someone who was about 10 years older than me, was a teenager in the age before the internet, and talking to that person about like what was normal sexually for teenagers was completely different than when I was a teenager. A lot of stuff that would have been considered like painful or degrading to the woman have become normalized among young people, and this is a direct result of porn. Like,
and that's a power difference for question.
Yeah, I think that's a valid and growing concern, like especially nowadays. I think probably most people in our age bracket who are choosing BDSM are choosing it out of their own free will, maybe. But I think a lot of people choose BDSM too because one partner wants it. And often because the dom wants it. That's an issue. That's a big issue. But like, I think BDSM can be healthy. I think it's an outlet to be able to play out animalistic shit.
Well, and you might be an outlet for processing past trauma in a safe environment, like equivalent exposure therapy. I think that's a great argument for some cases of BDSM. In fact, my perception is that the healthiest cases of BDSM that I've heard about or experienced are cases where somebody has past trauma that they're processing. And that's exactly like exposure therapy. Because with exposure therapy, you say it's paradoxical. Why would the treatment be the same as the cause? But the difference is that one was without consent, that whatever traumatized you, and one is with consent. And it's the same thing. It's just substituting the variables in the case of BDSM. But let's be clear, like kink shaming is also a power difference to question. So like the power of like vanilla normal sexuality over taboo sexuality is another power difference to question.
I guess the way I see it is like, I'm not totally sure how like the idea of like incorporating elements of BDSM into sex like does seem healthy to me, but also the idea of it seems like the risk with BDSM and kink is becoming addicted to a particular kind. And as soon as it gets to that point, it's suddenly like I find it to be like very repelling. Like people who can only have sex when dressed up in a certain costume, or only have sex when they have porn on their phones, or only have sex when they're hit. It just seems like it's very easy to become addicted to it. Maybe that's the part that seems unhealthy to me.
Yeah, it seems like
when it becomes a fetish.
They're trapped in a particular fixation, as Freud might put it.
Yeah, and then you have to like keep taking the fixation further and further and further. You know, as like going down a tunnel.
What do you guys think of this idea of monogamy as a kink?
As a fetish.
Honestly, I see no evidence at all for that. I think monogamy is. I think monogamy is a cultural institution in order to provide like societal stability. I don't think people enjoy. I don't think people enjoy it. You know, like just by default. You know, I think maybe people.
Well, people enjoy power.
Like people wouldn't necessarily choose it unless it was enforced somehow.
Lots of people would choose to try to control their partner without anyone telling them to do it.
I mean, you could say monogamy is as much about surrender as it is about control.
Exactly. Both parties have more control and less control.
I would say pair bonding is about a kind of surrender, but I think enforced monogamy is about control. It's about enforcement.
Well, it seems like you're just highlighting that element instead of highlighting the element of like sacrifice.
The enforced part means societally enforced. It means that there's a cultural enforcement. There's like ostracization for breaking the rules. That has nothing to do with the power dynamic within the relationship.
Oh no, it's got a lot to do with it. That's the thing. And I was going to say earlier that like what concerns me more than like any like whatever like the existence of BDSM or something like that is the attitude that seems prevalent that it's completely separable from someone's political alignment. That like, oh yeah, like, you know, I'm a dom, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm authoritarian politically. It's like if somebody said that, it's like, well, yeah, not necessarily. But like in that case, I would want to see the data. You know, like what is the correlation between authoritarian political views and like practicing authoritarian sexual practices or something like that? I mean, who knows? Maybe sometimes it's inversely correlated because like someone is like it's like a relief valve or something.
I tend to agree, like that what we do sexually like penetrates our souls.
Yeah, I mean, you can't just stipulate that like something you do in one part of your life isn't going to influence your mind and thereby influence something you do in another part of your life.
So, I mean, this kind of leads into an interesting question. Like, so relationship anarchy is something that flows from methodological anarchism, at least in your case. Like how can we contrast that with other relationship structures, and where might they flow from other forms of politics?
Strictly hierarchical polyamory, for instance. Maybe someone has only one primary partner and they have a certain number of secondary, maybe they even have tertiary partners. How romantic. Oh, you're my favorite tertiary partner. That's strictly hierarchical polyamory. I mean, there's sometimes you get like polyamory, which is like non-hierarchical, except for the hierarchy of whether someone's your partner or not, at least claims to be that way. Like, all my partners are equally my partner, except, you know, well, they're all equally someone's partner, you might say, but then everyone else is equally not their partner. So there's still a power difference there. And you can question that one too, not to say that one isn't easy to answer. Like, there's lots of obvious reasons why not everyone should be everyone's partner. Brave New World notwithstanding. I mean, that's kind of a reduction of absurd in Brave New World that like everyone belongs to everyone.
So I kind of want to bring back something that you mentioned before, the relationship escalator. So there are clearly sort of stages on this relationship escalator, and the higher stages are valued more, right?
Currently. Okay,
so in relationship anarchy, wouldn't you place a higher value on the relationships that are higher up the relationship escalator?
Well, I mean, I forget if I said this earlier, it's also important to think of there being multiple escalators at once, because you might be going up the emotion escalator and down the sex escalator. You know, it is possible to have less sex with somebody and also become more emotionally attached to them, or vice versa.
Okay, but clearly you have better relationships with some people than with other people, right?
Okay. Like if you just mean that like if you take a randomly selected person that I know and say like, would you be better off not knowing them? Then like some people you'd be much worse off not knowing them, and there are some people you'd be better off not knowing.
Yeah, or some people are more worth spending time with than other people, because you already have a good relationship with them.
So like,
Well,
part of what I'm getting is that it's multidimensional. So it's like when there's multiple dimensions, you don't get the same kind of strict dominance or strict ordering. Because like with a value like money, there's only one axis. So like it's determinate whether you have more money or I have more money. But like, if there's suppose you and I are both in relationships and my relationship is more like sexually gratifying and your relationship is more emotionally gratifying, who has the better relationship? Well,
sure. I mean, obviously there are gray areas, but I think there are also black and white areas.
well, it's not a gray area because like gray is still like a continuum. It's just like another dimension. Like when you have an axis, an X and Y axis, you don't say there's a gray area between X and Y.
Right. I'm saying that there exist cases like that are hard to measure, but I'm saying there are other cases that are easy to measure. Right?
Maybe, but I'm not totally sure because there's also there's all the dimensions, and each dimension also has like the aspectuality of potential and actual. So like I've definitely had times on psychedelics where I've just like started talking to a complete stranger and had like really profound experiences.
Well, sure.
So it's a question. Can we connect with anybody? So go ahead, Katie.
I was going to say, to add another dimension to this, like relationship anarchy isn't just about your romantic relationships, right? Like if you're talking about comparing your relationships and their level of closeness or goodness in a anarchist sense, I mean, you probably wouldn't do that, but you'd also have to bring in like my relationship with my mom versus my relationship with my best friend versus my relationship with my co-founder versus my relationship with my boyfriend.
Or with your dog.
Or with my dog, yeah.
Right, and what I'm saying is all of those relationships are difficult to value, or difficult to sort of measure all on the same axis. I'm definitely giving you that, but what I'm saying is there are other, like clearly there are metrics that for how well a relationship is going, and you want to try to increase those metrics as much as possible in all of your relationships. But with some people, it's just going to be harder than with other people.
I don't know. Is your point? Is it an objection to relationship anarchy or what?
My objection is to the notion that all relationships should be valued the same. Obviously, they should not.
Yeah, it's just that it's almost like the relationships can never even be the same, like let alone be valued the same.
Okay, all right. So we're in agreement on that point. We're in agreement on that point that some relationships are more valuable than others, and actually one of the most meaningful things that you can do in a relationship is you can increase the value of that relationship.
No, I don't agree. Once it's collapsed to one dimension, you just say like this is more valuable than that overall.
So can you compare a relationship to itself in the past? Can you say like this relationship is more valuable to me than it was in the past?
How can it be though?
Because you've put time and effort into it, and you trust the person more, and so it's worth a lot more to you now than it was then.
This is more of an
when you first met them. Yeah.
Well, I mean, not every investment is something that people hold on to. I mean, I'm inclined to say that like normally a relationship gets better in one way and like worse in some other way at the same time.
I don't understand why anybody would object to that. Like, I don't know. Clearly, my relationship to my mom is more valuable to me than my relationship with the guy that I bump into every once in a while and say hi to, but don't even know his name.
Exactly.
This might be a having mode, being mode thing.
Yeah, it's weird to say valuable. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a matter of collapsing things to one dimension. And I think, speaking of being skeptical of capitalism long ago in this conversation, I think it's actually related to like the omnipresence of capitalism in our thinking, because like money involves reducing everything to a single axis. So you can say like, definitely I would pay more for this than I'd pay for that. And that's part of being like homo economicus, like a rational.
Okay. Actually, that's a great way to do it. I would definitely pay way more money to maintain some of my relationships than I would pay to maintain other relationships.
Okay, but that's a very poor signal of what's actually going on there. A lot of information loss. A lot of information is lost in that analysis.
Information is lost, but I think you can still make the comparison, is what I'm saying.
You can make it harmfully in some cases, and reducing things to money is often harmful.
Yeah, that's kind of a weird thing to say too, because if nearly any of my relationships was all of a sudden in a situation where I needed to pay to maintain them, I would probably want to end that relationship.
Unless it was like ransom or something.
Sure.
Yeah, how much ransom would you pay to save? This is like
yeah, exactly. That's a great example. Like they say they get kidnapped, and the kidnappers are demanding money. How much will you pay for that person? I would assert that different people you would pay different ransoms for.
I don't think anyone's questioning. I don't think anyone's questioning that, though, Chris. I think that the argument is just that.
I think it sounds like Adam is questioning that.
No, he's not.
No, because empirically you could run the experiment and definitely the numbers.
Okay, that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, well, let's say some more then, though, because they wouldn't just be different from different people; they'd be different from the same person on different days.
Of course, yeah, but clearly the people who have been the highest value are going to continue to be the highest values.
Okay, but no one's questioning that. Like, we'll all pay a different ransom for our
different people.
Our kid than a stranger we bump into on the street.
Unless you don't negotiate with terrorists at all.
I think what I interpreted Adam as saying is just that that's an impoverished way to look at relationship.
I think this is an impoverished way. I agree. Like, I think this is a very impoverished way to look at relationships. Like, can you imagine, like, Ariel and Chris, like, what if, I don't know, what if Adam asked me, like, Katie, would you pay more ransom for Ariel or for Chris? How much would you pay for each?
Yeah, if you want to film your next episode, you're going to need her alive.
I would pay a lot for both of you. I don't think I want to decide which one I would value higher right now. But I'll absolutely answer the question, which one would I pay more for, one of you or some random person on the street? I would obviously pay more for you.
Thanks, Chris.
I don't know. If I was the only person who could save the random person on the street, I don't know that I would pay more. Like, if I was the person, it's like, Katie, you pay ransom to rescue this random person on the street or we're going to kill him. Versus you pay ransom. Like, I would just pay as much money as I could in any case.
Yeah, I mean, me and Chris probably have parents who can also help. The random person on the street might not.
That just means you don't have any boundaries, Katie.
That's not what it means. I want to say, I find both of these ways of looking at it actually kind of impoverished. Like the multi-dimensional measure of value and the unidimensional measure of value.
Yeah, well, the multi-dimensional one isn't supposed to be a way of looking at it. It's just supposed to be an argument against the first way.
Yeah, I get it. It's just they're both having modes. They're both having mode way of looking at relationships.
Yeah, like, how much value do you get?
We construct our relationship like a business plan and decide which business plan.
Maximize the value.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that that you have preferences you have a hierarchy of relationships.
Of course I do.
And what I'm saying is there are people at the top who you would give basically your life for, and there are people at the bottom who you would give basically nothing for. And I'm saying there's relationships, there's all sorts of people in between. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's hard to compare, this person to this person sometimes, but it's really easy to compare this person to this person.
What I'm saying is my preferences for different relationships don't necessarily correlate to what I would give to save another person's life.
Yeah, I mean, the underlying assumption here is that forced choice scenarios reveal your preferences. And I'm saying that is not true in part because of the assumption of one dimension. A forced choice situation is one dimensional. And if your preferences are multi-dimensional, then forced choice situations are going to fail to give you certain information about them.
Yeah, like for example, okay, lifeboat scenario, you can only save one person. It's my close friend who's elderly versus a child. I probably save the child.
Doesn't mean that the child's your close friend.
Right, and it doesn't mean that I love the child more than the elderly person. It also probably means, they would probably want me to make that choice too.
Yeah, but if there's a choice of who to block on Instagram, it would go the other way.
Exactly.
I mean, the original question here was about whether different political and philosophical beliefs would lead to different actions in relationships, which is kind of an interesting question.
How did you frame it again? Whether personal choice? Yeah.
Well, if relationship anarchy follows from an anarchist epistemology, does monogamy follow from a certain political epistemology? Would anarcho-capitalism lead to a certain relationship structure? Can we make any kind of comparisons there at all?
Back up slightly there, because I know you said it this way before, and it's like a small point, but I want to correct it, at least in terms of how I think of it. So, methodological anarchism doesn't lead to relationship anarchy. Relationship anarchy just is applying that method in the context of relationships.
Okay.
So, I'm viewing relationship anarchy as methodological as well. So it's just a subset of.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it doesn't necessarily lead anywhere. In a different world, with different contingent facts, you might be able to make all sorts of arguments in favor of authoritarianism that don't apply today. So it could be that on some other planet and some other timeline, the challenge can be met, and actually there's a lot of legitimate authority that's possible compared to, say, today.
I mean, to get a little bit,
so it could lead anywhere.
To get a little bit politically incorrect. I mean, there's a lot of parts of the world today where we see. Okay, I'm thinking specifically of the Islamic world, where we see very authoritarian political systems paired with very authoritarian sets of rules and regulations and norms around relationships.
They actually get into this in the Stanford article on positive and negative liberty, which I looked up because you brought it up the last time we talked on a recording. There was a claim made in there, basically, that there's a difference between regulating the content of someone's preference and regulating how the preference is formed. So if you had a law that said, like, women must not wear the hijab, there you're regulating the content of the preference. But if you had a law that said, like, women must be informed about the possibility of not wearing the hijab and how, like, they're entitled to do that without punishment or something like that, and then you might say that's a more reasonable requirement to say, like, make sure that someone is informed so that the preference that they do form is informed by information, as opposed to saying they must reach this conclusion based on the information. I think that makes a big difference. I mean, I do. It's related to saying, like, take, like, the Catholic school system in Ontario, right? You might say, well, the heck is that? We're supposed to have separation of the church and state. Why do we have a funded Catholic school board and all this?
In Ontario, we have both a public school system and a Catholic school system that's also government funded. Continue.
Yeah, so we have government funded Catholic schools. I mean, I've usually taken the position that, because some people say, like, they should be abolished or should they not be abolished. I say it's conditional. I'd say that if they aren't abolished, then other schools should be state funded for other world religions that have, like, let's say, a large number of members globally, so that students, children can make an informed decision about world religions and actually know the content of a little bit of the content of all of them. Obviously, it'd be a lot to, like, nobody knows the full content of one world religion, but, and then it's an informed choice. No, it's not a matter of regulating the choice. It's a matter of making sure the choice is informed. So I think that's a big, and I feel the same way, I guess, about monogamy and polyamory, that a lot of people are informed about the alternatives, to say the least.
But for people who are and then still choose monogamy, do you think that they're making a bad or unhealthy choice? Well, I guess you said that you see it as a fetish.
Well, if they're choosing it, if they're trying to get their partner to do it, getting your partner to not fuck somebody else, I see that as a fetish. I know people see the reverse, as if getting your partner to fuck somebody is a fetish, but it's defined as a fetish because it's relative to the standard, like, the prevailing social norms, I think.
Well, what about like in business relationships? There's, like, a lot of situations where you're choosing to partner with somebody to found a business, and you might sign something like, we both agree not to work on anything else for a while because we both want to commit very strongly to this.
Well, I did recently counsel a musician not to sign exclusive agreements for music, kind of for, like, analogous reasons. I was like, look, I wouldn't make an exclusive agreement for an album or a relationship.
Yeah, I think there are benefits to making exclusive agreements for both parties in many cases. And I don't think it needs to be like a fetishy or a control thing. I think it's just we're choosing to sacrifice something so that we can build this right now.
In most cases, maybe there's some exception to this, but I think in most cases it could be reframed as a positive commitment. So instead of saying, like, because imagine you have a job that's like, I take moonlighting, for example, right? Like, you have a job that doesn't pay enough, so you need a second job. But the first job told you can't moonlight. And so you're technically breaking that agreement, but actually you need to make more money, or you want to make more money to achieve some goal. And the employer is going to say, like, yes, but, like, you're running yourself down, so we're not getting, like, your full self. You're, like, more exhausted. And so that's, like, doesn't, But if you really are running yourself down, they could tell that directly in your performance. If it doesn't actually affect your performance, and say it doesn't affect your performance in your personal relations in the long term, you're not, like, literally not sleeping or something like that, then you might say that it's just them being controlling past that point. That you should be able to tell somehow the impact directly. Otherwise, you're not justifying that restriction on their freedom. So, like, you're not meeting the burden of proof.
Well, yes, but if there's something that, like, due to you, like, people have a lot of experience with falling in love and having sex with other people. It's something that we generally know is disruptive and brings some chaos. And, like, it's okay. I think it's okay to preemptively say we don't want to invite that. I don't have an issue with the company saying we don't want you moonlighting either if they've had a lot of issues with it in the past. Like, maybe we could say it's them being controlling. I think that would depend on the negotiating power of the other party. Like, if it's a situation where two people are coming into a relationship freely and choosing to be monogamous, I think that's very different versus, I don't know, one person has a lot more bargaining power than the other and says, I don't want you to sleep with anybody else, but I'm free to do what I want.
I mean, I feel like that free choice is kind of theoretical in today's context because monogamy is so widespread. Because, you know, some people have experience of having two jobs and whatever. And not that many people have experience of loving two people at the same time, not being shamed for it, and having a community of people who accept that around them. Because generally people meet a lot of friction to the very idea, let alone like support in like having that kind of relationship.
Well, that's true, but I do, and I'm choosing monogamy.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel that way too.
It seems like a not insignificant percentage of people who do have experience with polyamory and relationship anarchy choose monogamy at some point.
Lots of people choose a simple life for themselves. Like some people choose not to take a second job, some people choose not to take a second partner. But I don't think that has to happen out of trying to satisfy your partner necessarily. I mean, I was going to say the insecurities of your partner. It's not always insecurity, but that's a big part of it. Like the codependency stuff we got into is related to that, right? Like I wish everybody would crave each other's freedom. And I think that is psychologically realistic, actually.
I mean, I guess I feel like there's some truth to what you're saying, but I also feel like there's an assumption.
Okay.
Like it seems to me that you're sort of making the assumption that the reason a lot of people choose monogamous relationships is that they're trying to specifically limit their partner's ability to have sex with other people, or they're trying to specifically like the goal, their goal or the attraction is to limit or control the partner. Whereas for me, I think for a lot of people, my attraction to monogamy is I want to experience the fruits of monogamy. So like that limitation, that mutual limitation is a means, not an end.
We're miscommunicating slightly. So I'm not assuming that that's the motivation. I'm saying if we're talking about enforced monogamy, then there has to be an enforcement mechanism that we're talking about. If we're just talking about accidental monogamy, that's fine.
I know, but you're okay. You're calling you're characterizing monogamy as a fetish or a kink. Of control. But okay, but I'm saying the enforcement isn't necessarily something. The enforcement isn't necessarily the part that people are being attracted to.
Okay.
The part that people could be attracted to is something that the enforcement or the constraint, I would call it, that the constraint can produce.
I don't think all monogamy needs to be enforced. Like I don't imagine enforcing monogamy in my current relationship or future relationship in any kind of way. Like if my partner no longer wanted to be monogamous with me, it would be a big discussion, and I would probably be sad. Maybe we talk about opening up, or maybe we talk about breaking up. Like
I don't mean to say that you don't have the freedom to do this, but talking about breaking up is a kind of enforcement. So like the probability with which somebody will break up with you for wanting an open relationship is like varies societally, let's say, and let's say it's gone down. Like 20 years ago, your chance of getting broken up with for saying, hey, have you ever heard of an open relationship, was much higher than today. And that's a kind of like market level coercion, if we're going to fall back into crass economic metaphors. But, in terms of like the distribution of how willing people are to be open-minded, whatever. It is true for any kind of open-mindedness, true. Like it might be difficult finding people who are willing to consider weird ideas too, and if it's too difficult for people who want to, be open-minded in some way to sometimes it's pluralistic ignorance, right? I do think there's a lot of pluralistic ignorance that I think that if it weren't societally shamed, a lot more people would actively practice polyamory.
Don't we get back to the incel thing, though? Isn't this back to the incel thing, though? Like, kind of suck it up, buttercup, if you can't find someone who doesn't want to be poly with you?
Well, maybe it is, but if you say on the one hand, well, anyone can reject monogamy, anyone can reject polyamory in a specific relationship, that also means it's possible for people to try to campaign for some kind of collective action saying like, well, yeah, you can vote that way, but here's how you should vote. And based on this reasoning or this, political movement or something. I think people should decline relationships that are exclusive. I think people should decline labor contracts that are exclusive. I think people should decline record deals that are exclusive. All else be equal. Maybe there are exceptions, but I think that should be the default position.
I mean, for me, it's just it seems strange that you're sort of defining it as being coercive or enforcement, that someone wouldn't want to be in a poly relationship. Like, to me, that's just consent.
Right.
If someone is like, if you can sleep with me, but I'm going to be sleeping with these 12 other people, like, it's my ability to consent to say, no, I'm not interested.
Right. And then it's also, so suppose that's true, then it's also, so like in the Lysistrata example, you can use personal boundaries for collective action. So just because it's a personal boundary and like everyone has like this individual maybe right or autonomy or, ability to say what they're going to do personally, you can still ask the question of what's a good strategy collectively.
Yeah, see, this is the difference, I think, between the sort of leftist anarchist way of seeing things and the sort of more anarcho-capitalist way of seeing things. Anarcho-capitalists say, if you value the relationship and the contract says to do a certain thing, then you do that thing if you want to continue having that relationship. So if the relationship says, if you're in a business relationship or labor relationship that says you can't moonlight or something like that, but you really, really, really value that business relationship, you really, really value that job, then you're not going to moonlight because that's what the contract says and you value that relationship. If you don't value the relationship, then, you should just say that. You should just say, well, no, I don't want to agree to this, basically.
You wouldn't be forced to do that as often as more people said no to those contracts.
Okay. So this idea that like there's going to be collective action on behalf of like people who want polyamory, to me, whether or not that's going to happen is like very much contingent on this question of like, is relationship anarchy / polyamory, like, is relationship anarchy good for women?
Well, I think it's good for everyone to question power. You can apply, I gave the example of an abusive partner. You can apply relationship anarchy to questioning domestic violence, for instance, right? Because there's a power difference if one person is using physical strength to coerce somebody. That's applying anarchy to relationships. It's questioning a power difference. Right. I mean, we've focused a lot on the polyamory side of it because, there's a lot of controversy to be settled there, I think, in today's society. But it's less controversial that you should question the power difference of an abusive partner.
I'm not entirely convinced that relationship anarchy or polyamory is the solution to domestic violence. I
mean, let me put it this way. Feminism is a kind of anarchism because it's questioning gendered power as opposed to, say, questioning state power or race power.
Okay, that's like an anarcho-feminist perspective. Okay.
Yeah. So I think the answer is kind of easy to say yes there. I think the question you want to ask is whether promiscuity is good for women.
Yeah, that is a good question.
And look, I don't know how much promiscuity is the right amount. I've tried various levels and got various results. I mean, that's a very difficult question. I think it's great not to control your partner. I don't know what that tells us of how much sex to have, if you see what I'm saying. And I think being non-coercive has nothing to do with being promiscuous. I do think there's related issues like slut shaming and mononormativity. Like they're both social forces that make people not really question the alternative. Like, oh, maybe I can be a slut. Oh, maybe I can also be non-coercive to people. Or they might ask those questions in the other order. But yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, we've talked before about how people are too glib about casual sex, and it's not easy to keep sex casual. That's for sure. And there's probably something. I mean, I found it kind of toxic years ago that casual sex was normalized before long-term polyamory was. When I first started university, you could pick up Psychology Today from the drugstore to be like, did you know that people today are starting to have casual sex again? I mean, it had been a couple of decades since the 60s, and it's time for round 2 of the sexual revolution, I guess. But they only started it with this kind of politically not very threatening thing of these ephemeral relationships that don't build into a long-standing structure that could rival any other structure.
I mean, to me, that seems like a side effect of the fact that nihilism is much more widespread than anarchism.
Say more with that.
Well, to me, casual sex seems very nihilistic because it's all about sex without meaning, whereas relationship anarchy is anarchistic.
That's the worst kind of casual sex, I guess. I mean, you can have brief and meaningful interactions, be like your long conversations with people on psychedelics, and I don't know what else you do on psychedelics.
What are we defining as casual sex?
Yeah. Well, I just meant sex without any kind of commitment, because I think that like even when it's like a short-term relationship, I think having sex with somebody does entail emotional commitments to them in terms of like aftercare, and they might want to talk to you a year later about a sexual experience they had with you, and like I think by default you should be available for that conversation, like regardless of your gender.
For me, casual sex is sex that's separated from other elements of life, emotion, and psychology to some degree, which to me, even that move seems nihilistic.
To me, that move seems... like for most people, you would have to suppress a lot of emotion in order to get there. Like if someone naturally doesn't have feelings about the sex they're having and both parties are okay with that, then I don't see a problem with that. But I think that the problem I have more with it is like, I think that sex does usually come with feelings. And if you're trying to pretend that it's not, then that's going to cause issues.
Yeah, I mean, there's casual sex just to pursue a drive, but you also could pursue casual sex to achieve emotionality, to make your life more emotional. You're like, oh, my life doesn't feel very emotional.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's more healthy, actually. I tend to think that our society doesn't accept nearly an intense enough level of emotion regularly, that we're all sort of cramped in some small space that, like, you're supposed to feel roughly in this box, and that will keep the system chugging along just as it is. I mean, I think I posted a few weeks ago, if you stigmatize extreme emotion, then revolution is impossible.
I don't know, though. I don't really feel like... I guess I used to do that, kind of, like, just...
Doesn't mean it's always helpful.
No, but I'm going to have casual sex so I feel something. Or I'm going to take a drug so that I feel something.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, casual sex feels like a drug to me. It feels like... I like when I've done it in the past, it's just because, like, I had this urge and I was like, I need to have sex. And then I did it and it was like, yeah, it feels like right after you masturbate or right after you, like right after you do some drug, it's like, well, I guess I need more, maybe, like it's like a bottomless pit.
I think it can be that way. I think it can be other ways. I think it can be like you want to be independent as a person. You don't want to invest in a romantic relationship right now, but you still at times want to experience the level of intimacy with people that you only experience in sexual relationships, or like that particular type of intimacy. And I also don't think it's bad to experience that with multiple people. That allows you to receive a lot of perspectives. It depends on why and how you're doing it.
I guess the word casual is part, like, if you're treating such a profound experience as casual, doesn't it imply that you're treating all the intensity and profundity of life as isn't it in some sense a denial of meaning and intensity and profundity in life?
Yeah, I guess I don't like the term casual.
Yeah, what ephemeral sex, ephemeral sexuality?
Ephemeral sex sounds better.
I mean, definitely, like, when I was young and inexperienced, like, sometimes I was just like, I need to get laid, like, for my own self-esteem, And then once I got over that, then it stopped having any benefit for me.
I mean, that seems like using. And that also seems like it would do dangerous things to your psychology.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's another side effect of an economic metaphor, because I don't think you just needed to satisfy a drive. I think you probably learned from that experience, even though it might have been like a really involved relationship. Like, it's like there's something educational about being intimate with another person for any kind of intimacy, sort of by definition. Like, you're not learning anything from them. How intimate is this, connection?
Yeah, or
not necessarily propositional, like facts or principles or something.
Or negative experiences can be educational. Like,
yep.
I'm just like, when you're young and you're a guy, I don't know if this happens to women, but like for me, it was like, I'm going to have sex and then question, profit, it's like, and then things are going to be great. Right. And then, it turns out that's not how it always is. Sometimes you don't end up connecting emotionally with the person.
Follow those porn clips went on for longer, you learn that the payoff doesn't work out in the long term in most of those stories. In terms of what men are exposed to.
Yeah, you mean like if they showed the whole movie instead of just like the scene, the sex scene.
Yeah, including the custody battle and everything.
I'm wondering if we can all agree that it seems like porn is having a negative impact on people's relationships in general.
I 100% agree with that, and on society.
Yeah, I'm pretty porn skeptical. I largely gave it up after consuming it a lot when I was younger, and I do think it was healthy psychologically. There's a good website called Your Brain on Porn, which unfortunately is a bit of a religious slant, but it's pretty interesting in terms of like treating porn addiction like a drug addiction. Although I do think it's really great that it exists at all compared to an environment in which people just don't learn anything all about sex until they're doing it. But I think obviously the porn we have is the product of these really sick market forces. And so, it's we have clickbait problems all over the internet, not just with porn. Like, our news is very porny as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like it. If you're smart though, and you realize that it is doing harm to you by clicking on those things and watching those things, eventually you kind of get like this sense for like, okay, I shouldn't click on that. Like it's actually going to waste my time. It's going to make me a very slightly worse person. And I might as well just do something different.
Yeah, but if they treat it like a drug, not everyone gets addicted to a drug. It depends on past trauma, actually, whether someone's likely to get addicted to a physical drug. And I imagine it's the same with porn addiction.
I wonder whether, like, it makes me think, like, what you guys are talking about, like in the past, like 100 years ago or 150 years ago, like it would be, like, people wouldn't go out, like, show their bodies in public kind of thing. Like you only even really see someone else's body when you were like married to them and about to have sex. And like there's a lot of drawbacks to that. But I imagine it would be like super intense. Whereas like today, whether you're watching porn or not, like you're seeing other people's bodies like mostly naked or completely naked like all the time. And then there's like this porn industry where like you can just masturbate or witness like this like really intense sex. And it just seems like maybe we feel like we've become desensitized.
Yeah, desensitization is a big issue and like ties into the drug addiction angle as well. I was going to say the artificiality of it is a problem because like on the one hand, like I think of monogamy as artificial scarcity. And, like, I think of intellectual property as artificial scarcity, but porn gives you also this artificial abundance of, like, oh, you can just, like, snap your fingers and be having sex in a simulated way. And it's like that the artificial abundance of porn is kind of damaging. And actually, yeah, you know, especially, you know, there's no after story or even pre-story. It's just like sex is happening now, sex is not happening. It's like there's no narrative. Not that the narratives that are there really help, but... You know, in real life, there's a narrative, there's a whole story that leads into your relationship and a story that leads out of it if it de-escalates. I mean, supposedly Pornhub is getting involved in education efforts and they're also going to plant trees or something. I mean, I think a lot of it's a side effect of the whole capitalist setup, right? Because, like, what's profitable? Clicks are profitable. I mean, that's not just a feature of capitalism. It's like the current structure of the internet and all of that. It's pretty bad, but I think artificiality is a big issue, whether it's artificial abundance or artificial scarcity. Because, like, if you, on the one hand, being able to just click and see porn any time, that's artificial abundance of sex. On the other hand, not seeing somebody unclothed until you're married to them, that's artificial scarcity of, like, human intimacy and, like, knowledge of even the human body, you know. And, you know, it should come about more naturally as opposed to, you know, in the one case, you have some societal norms that are sort of from outside creating that. In the case of like mores that are like, don't show your ankles until you're married or whatever, you know. I mean, in the case of the internet, the abundance is created by this business. It's artificial in the sense that it's not how it happens naturally in sexuality. I mean, maybe that's not that artificial for the business. Maybe it's natural for capitalism to happen that way, but that's a natural tendency.
It's the question too, if capitalism is natural.
Yeah. I mean, I want to go back to the economics thing and I footnote something that we might look into at another point. There's actually an article that came out just last year called The Incompletability of Markets, and it's about this whole question of, can you put a dollar value on anything? Can you take two things and say which you would pay more for? And they were talking about, well, you know, people have often said that it seems maybe counterintuitive or it's very difficult or like people don't give consistent answers. But this article went a step further and they actually claimed that you can show mathematically that if you insist that any two things are preferable, but you also allow meta preferences, like preferences about preferences, like what I wish you wanted or something like that. If you have both of those together, they actually end up contradicting each other and creating paradoxes.
I'm not sure I understand.
Could you give an example?
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to give an example of how it creates the paradox mathematically. It's a little involved, but the intuitive stuff that they cite leading up to their more formal analysis is like any kind of forced choice setting. Like I was saying earlier, the forced choice experiment doesn't necessarily reveal your preferences. You know, partly that your preferences are inconsistent. They might be conditional. It might be that, like, you know, yeah, my preference in this one forced choice setting is this, but my preference in this other forced choice setting is something else. It's analogous to how, like, with science experiments, there's, like, internal versus external validity. So, like, just naturally in the world, you don't get perfectly controlled experiments. You don't just end up by chance with a situation where all the variables are controlled, except for one. So, like, there's always confounds. And if you create an experiment where you do control all the variables, well, that's an unnatural situation because normally all the variables aren't controlled. So it's not... Right,
that in and of itself is a confound.
Yeah. So these thought experiments that we were doing, as much as I was saying, like, yeah, you know, I like doing these thought experiments, but they're artificial in the sense that in the thought experiment, you know for sure which variable is related to which variable because it's controlled, but only in that setting. Once you switch it to another scenario, you know, it made me think of this movie I saw when I was a kid about an adult choosing which kid to let die. This movie called The Good Son. I mean, spoiler alert, got Macaulay Culkin and Elijah Wood. And at the end of the movie, here's the spoiler, the biological mother of Macaulay Culkin in the movie has to choose whether to let Macaulay Culkin or Elijah Wood fall off the cliff. She's like holding them both with her hands. And her biological son is evil is the premise of the movie. So she ultimately chooses to let her biological son die because he's evil and lets her like foster son essentially live. And so that's a forced choice scenario. And it's like very close to all these examples you're doing of hostage scenarios. That forced choice scenario doesn't actually reveal necessarily. Now, the way the movie is set up, you realize that in that scenario, she probably would have made the decision in a lot of different situations. But you could have written a different movie with the same ending, where she chooses to let Macaulay Culkin die, but not for any particular reason, just because she made a panic choice at the last minute. And like, in a slightly different scenario, she would have made the other choice, in which case it's actually close to 50-50, but the forced choice scenario, at least if it's not iterated, gives you this illusion of like you've tested the preference and revealed it. But if you did it over and over again, like kept, respawning Macaulay Culkin, see if she would repeatedly kill Macaulay Culkin, then you might find out that it's 50-50, even though you thought you were revealing someone's preference with that forced choice. Yeah. I mean, the details of that paper gets into a lot more, but there's intuitive and formal reasons to resist the idea that you can always say between two things which you would pay more for.
Well, sure, but I think there are cases that are more obvious. Like two of your children, obviously, it's going to be hard to choose between them. But I think there are cases that are more obvious, where no matter how many times you play the experiment, it's always going to have the same result.
Yeah, sometimes. Although I think the more realistic the scenario is, the more variables there are. So the lower the probability that all the variables will be sort of naturally controlled. Because if there's only 3 variables, then you might say like, oh, it happens sometimes that these 2 variables are the same, and this is the variable that's different, and that's the decision that you make every time when that controlled scenario rises up. But there's like, when there's a million variables, it doesn't even happen over and over again, because it never happens repeatedly that all of the same variables are controlled.
I mean, I think a lot of the difficulty in discussing this is we don't like to talk about that we value certain people more than other people, but I think it's unquestionable that we do this.
Honestly, I think part of the look, sometimes we don't want to talk about it just because it's taboo, and I get that, but I don't think it's just that. I think sometimes we don't like to talk about it because we have an instinct to avoid destroying information and making comparisons that have sort of like illusory precision. And people have an instinct when they're being, we all have that feeling of like a forced choice that makes us feel really uncomfortable. And we feel like every answer is wrong. And sometimes it is true that every answer is wrong, because even though it might be the technically correct answer, that like, yes, empirically, if we were to put you in that situation, this is a correct prediction of what you would do in that situation or something like that. Or, or even might be the morally right answer. That doesn't mean that answering the question is the right thing to do. Because there can be questions that it's wrong to answer because of how it frames things. And, and not necessarily because you're going to give a wrong answer. But sometimes it's because any answer you give would be wrong.
I'm aware of the time. If I don't have any like burning points to make, maybe now would be the time.
One thing that I didn't get into, although it comes up a lot normally when I talk to people about this stuff, is I put it this way to a friend of mine recently who I had similar debates with. And, there's this idea that love is eternal for one person. And I think when people start breaking free of that idea, some people don't think that it's eternal, and some people don't think that it's for one person, but try to preserve the other half of the idea. And I'm more partial to the idea that it's eternal. That may just be me personally, that I'm maybe just bad at getting over things. But, I find that I don't fall out of love with people, which means that over time my love becomes more multiple, even if I fall out of the relationships. But personally, my feelings don't change as much as some people, and I think that's part of why I had to become polyamorous in practice.
I kind of agree. Like in my experience, I'm also really bad at getting over people, or I struggle to get over people. So I also tend to experience love as eternal, but I also tend to experience love as being very overwhelming. And so it's hard for me to be polyamorous because I tend to experience really overwhelming feelings for individual people that at least I interpret as crowding out other possibilities.
Yeah. And I'm the same way. And maybe that's just like maybe there's just personality differences, and some people are better at polyamory or relationship anarchy, and other people are more monogamous by nature.
Well, everyone's surely got a finite capacity for how much intimacy they can sustain. I don't believe the whole like love is infinite claim or whatever, but I do believe that it's not necessarily a rival good. Like sometimes love breeds more love. It's not necessarily a crowding effect. Sometimes I find that like, the other partner is supportive and it makes the other relationship go better, or just one relationship improves my mood and that makes the other relationship go better, or something like that. So it's not necessarily a rival good in that way.
I don't know. Yeah, that's like an argument for polyamory that I don't like very much. The whole like, this person meets this need, this person meets that need, this person meets that need. Well, it seems very usy.
I don't think it needs to be. Yeah, to be like fulfilling different parts of yourself, like transcendent in different ways.
Yeah, and like not wearing it, even if it's just a friend context, you don't want to wear out your one friend getting support from them all the time. You need different perspectives. You also need to not like wear somebody out by always turning to them for their perspective. Like for your sake, you need someone else's perspectives too, but for their sake, they need you to get someone else's perspective sometimes as well.
Yeah, I get the practicality of it.
I'm sure we could keep going with this for the next Few hours.
We should wrap
Yeah,
up.
I will say people can overextend themselves, and it's easy once you break free of the paradigm to be like, oh, I don't have to date just one person. That means I can date as many people as I want. Like, well, that's not true at all. I mean, like, you know, start small. You know, if somebody can successfully date two people, then it's time to date a third person or something like that. But, you know, absolutely. And just like there's a limit to how many children you could raise. I mean, psychologically, never mind like your financial resources.
Right.
Absolutely be realistic about everyone's psychological limits and stuff.
Well, great conversation, everyone. It was an honor to have you on the show, Adam. It was
great to be here.
Yeah, I definitely. Sorry, I got a little bit heated there.
I had a more heated argument with Ariel off camera one time, so that's fine.
Oh, well, me too.
At the top of an escalator, actually.
Yeah.
we were arguing at the top of an escalator.
Good imagery.
We freaked out that drugstore.
Yeah. And then we went back down the escalator. It was fine.
I mean, this episode was focused on a relationship anarchy specifically, but I'm interested too in kind of questioning capitalism with methodological anarchy. I think that would be another really interesting point of discussion that we might have a lot of disagreements about.
Yeah, we could even go through historically through the various anarchists or something.
That could be fun.
A lot to learn.
Cool.
Well, I just want to address the audience briefly. Thank you, everyone who watched along with us. Hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please like, subscribe, leave us a comment, check out our Patreon, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for joining us on the Multiversity Project. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversityproject.co.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.